The moment the papers landed on the kitchen table, Evelyn Ashford stopped breathing. Not because she hadn't expected them, not because she was unprepared, but because Adrian had chosen a Tuesday morning in March, while she was standing at the stove in her robe, 7 weeks past the point where her body had stopped being entirely her own, to end 5 years of marriage with a manila envelope and a post-it note that read, "Sign these. My lawyer will be in touch." He hadn't even stayed to watch her open it. That was the part that would stay with her the longest. Not the papers, not the legal language, not the cold precision of a document that reduced a marriage to asset columns and liability clauses. It was the sound of the front door clicking shut behind him. Quiet. Controlled. Final. Like he'd simply closed a browser tab he was done reading. She stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, the papers spread across the table in front of her. Then she picked up her phone, walked to the window, and made a call she hadn't made in almost 6 years. It rang twice. "Dad," she said, "it's time. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story doesn't go where you think it does. If this is your first time here, hit the like button and drop a comment with the city where you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels." The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, which was somehow the most Adrian Mercer thing about the whole situation. Not a Friday, when the weight of it might have had a full weekend to settle. Not a Monday, when the clinical cruelty of it could at least be absorbed alongside the ordinary misery of the start of a work week. A Tuesday. Because Adrian Mercer did not structure his life around the emotional convenience of other people. He structured it around efficiency, around outcomes, around the ruthless forward momentum that had taken him from a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, to the 43rd floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, where his name was on the building and his face appeared on the covers of magazines that described him with words like visionary and relentless, and once, memorably, the kind of man the market was designed to reward. Evelyn had laughed at that last one when she read it. She'd shown it to Adrian over breakfast and said, "The kind of man the market was designed to reward. That's either the greatest compliment or the most backhanded thing anyone has ever said about you." He had smiled and said, "I'll take it." That had been 3 years ago, before things shifted, before the warmth between them started thinning like ice in March, cracking in places neither of them named out loud, until one morning she woke up and realized she was living in a very expensive apartment with a stranger who shared her last name and occasionally remembered to ask how she was sleeping. She was sleeping badly, but she'd stopped saying so. Evelyn was 5 months pregnant when she found out about Cassandra Voss. She hadn't gone looking. She wasn't that kind of woman. Not paranoid, not possessive, not the type to go through a man's phone while he showered. She'd been raised to hold herself with too much dignity for that. Her mother had been precise about that lesson, even if she'd been imprecise about nearly everything else. What happened was simpler, and somehow worse for being so ordinary. She'd been looking for a charging cable in Adrian's home office when she found a weekend hotel receipt on his desk, not hidden, not even turned face down, just lying there with the kind of carelessness that either meant he didn't care if she saw it or had simply stopped thinking of her as someone who might. The Whitmore Hotel. 2 nights. 1 room. The charge for the room service included 2 glasses of wine, which was impossible because Adrian had been on a medically supervised low-alcohol diet since February, the kind of thing his publicist carefully omitted from his press profile. She stood holding the receipt for a long time. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it, walked out of the office, and went to make herself a cup of tea. She didn't confront him, not that night, not the next morning. She sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis you already suspected. Not surprised, just tired. Just terribly, profoundly tired, in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. 2 weeks later, the papers arrived. Cassandra Voss was 31 years old, vice president of strategic partnerships at Mercer Technologies, and extraordinarily good at her job. Evelyn had met her exactly 4 times, twice at company events, once at a charity gala where Cassandra had worn a dress that cost more than some people's monthly rent, and had stood just slightly too close to Adrian during the group photograph, and once in the lobby of the Mercer building when Evelyn had stopped by to drop off the winter coat Adrian had left at their apartment. Cassandra had been at the reception desk, and she had smiled at Evelyn with the particular warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. "Mrs. Mercer," she'd said, "what a nice surprise." It hadn't been a nice surprise for either of them. They both knew it. Evelyn had smiled back, left the coat, and taken a cab home. That had been 6 months ago. The morning the papers arrived, Adrian had been in the apartment for exactly 19 minutes. Evelyn knew because she'd been watching the clock above the stove. Not deliberately, just the way you track peripheral things when your brain is managing too much and has to anchor itself somewhere. He'd come in at 7:42. He hadn't said good morning. He'd gone straight to the kitchen table, set down the envelope, added the post-it note, and left at 8:01. 19 minutes. For 5 years of marriage and a child that was 7 weeks from being born. She stood at the stove for another 10 minutes after he left, the burner still on under the kettle, her hand resting on her stomach where the baby had been moving that morning. Small, persistent, rhythmic, like something knocking from the inside asking to be let in. Then she turned off the burner, sat down at the table, and opened the envelope. The language was exactly what you'd expect from a team of very expensive lawyers who had been asked to make a surgical incision look like a formality. Asset division, clearly negotiated in advance. A proposed custody arrangement that gave her primary physical custody and gave Adrian what the document called reasonable visitation rights, which told her more about how he thought of his unborn child than any conversation they'd had in months. A non-disclosure clause. A very generous financial settlement that she read once, understood immediately, and set aside without another glance. She read the whole thing twice. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and called her father. What? The phone rang twice before he picked up. He always picked up on the second ring, not the first because he believed answering on the first ring gave the impression of waiting, and he had not spent 40 years building what he built by looking like he was waiting for anything. Evie. His voice was the same as it always was, low, measured, warm in a way that people who only knew him professionally would have found surprising. Dad, she said, it's time. A pause. Not long. Her father was not a man who needed lengthy silences to process information. Where are you? The apartment. Are you all right? She looked down at her stomach. The baby had stopped moving, sleeping probably, or just resting, doing whatever it was that babies did in the weeks before they decided the world was ready for them. I'm okay, she said. I'm tired, but I'm okay. Do you need me to come there? No? She stood up, walked to the window. 43rd floor. The city spread out below her in the flat gray light of a March morning, traffic inching along, people walking fast with their heads down against the wind. She pressed one hand against the glass. I need you to make some phone calls. Another pause. Then, with something she might have called satisfaction if it hadn't been so quiet. Already working on it, he said. Evelyn Ashford had not spoken much about her family in the years she'd been married to Adrian Mercer. This was not an accident. When she'd met Adrian 8 years ago at an investment conference in Boston, she as an attendee, him as a speaker, both of them reaching for the same glass of water at a narrow conference table in a way that had felt accidental and in retrospect was probably exactly that. She had already made a deliberate choice to step back from the world she'd grown up in. Not to disappear from it, not to burn it down. Simply to step back. To exist on her own terms, in a life she'd built with her own hands rather than inherited from people who loved her but who had never quite asked her what she actually wanted. What she'd wanted, at 26, was a life that felt like hers, a marriage that wasn't a merger, a partner who saw her as a person rather than a portfolio. For 3 years, Adrian had been exactly that. He'd been brilliant and focused and occasionally maddening, the kind of man who forgot birthdays but remembered every detail of a conversation you'd had 6 months ago about something you barely remembered saying. He'd been present in the ways that mattered, and she'd loved him in the way you love someone when you've stopped being cautious, fully, without a safety net, the way you can only do when you genuinely believe the person deserves that kind of trust. Then the company had gone through its 3rd round of funding. Then the valuation had crossed $1 billion. Then the magazine profiles started. Then something in Adrian, some quiet, private part of him that had known how to simply be with another person, had slowly been replaced by something harder and more careful and infinitely more interested in what he was building than in the life he was building it in. She had watched it happen over 2 years. She had tried, twice, to name it out loud. He'd listened each time with the polite, slightly distracted attention of a man waiting for the relevant part of a meeting to begin. And she had understood eventually that the relevant part was never going to be her. What she had not told him what she had not told anyone in that world, was what she had walked away from to be with him. Charles Ashford was 68 years old and had the kind of face that made people immediately uncertain whether to trust him or be afraid of him. This was intentional. He had cultivated it over decades with the same meticulous care he applied to everything else: his portfolio, his relationships, the precise and largely invisible architecture of his influence across 4 continents. He was not famous. He had worked very hard to ensure that. His name appeared in financial circles the way certain legal terms appeared in contracts: present, significant, and understood by the people who needed to understand it. He did not seek publicity. He did not grant interviews. He had declined 3 separate requests to appear on financial news networks in the past year alone, each time through an assistant who offered no explanation and no callback number. The Ashford family had been in finance for 3 generations. But the way Charles Ashford operated finance, it was less an industry than an ecosystem, a vast interlocking web of investment vehicles, holding companies, trusts, and long-term agreements that touched sectors from infrastructure to technology to healthcare to real estate in ways that were technically public record and practically invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking. His daughter's husband was not looking. Adrian Mercer was an extraordinarily intelligent man. Charles had understood that from the first time he'd met him, 4 years into Adrian and Evelyn's marriage, at a small dinner in a private room at a restaurant in Midtown, where Charles had watched Adrian talk about his company with the focused intensity of someone who had confused the building of a thing with the point of it. Charles had shaken his hand at the end of the night and had thought clearly and without malice, "This man will hurt my daughter." He hadn't said so. Evelyn hadn't asked. And Charles Ashford had spent a lifetime learning the difference between protecting someone and deciding for them. So he had waited. He had watched. And when she called him on a Tuesday morning in March and said it's time, he had already spent 4 years learning exactly where every pressure point was. The first thing Evelyn did after she hung up with her father was call her obstetrician. Not because anything was wrong. The baby was fine. She could feel it. That particular quality of inner stillness that somehow communicated aliveness more clearly than movement. She called because she needed to hear a practical voice, a voice that was concerned with her blood pressure and her iron levels, and the position of a child who would need to enter the world in approximately 7 weeks, regardless of what the world looked like when it did. Dr. Priya Mehta had been her obstetrician for 3 years, and she had the particular gift of being both professionally thorough and personally discreet. She'd noticed things over the course of Evelyn's pregnancy. The shift in Evelyn's affect between the first and second trimester, the way she started coming to appointments alone, the careful blankness behind her eyes when Priya asked routine questions about home support systems. She hadn't pressed, but she'd noticed. "Everything okay?" Priya asked now. "Stress levels are manageable," Evelyn said, which was technically true and deliberately incomplete. "You're not alone, right? Someone's there with you?" Evelyn looked around the apartment. Adrian's apartment, technically. His name on the lease, his furniture, his art on the walls, a curated collection chosen by an interior designer he'd hired before they were married, pieces that cost significant money and communicated nothing personal about anyone who lived here. "Not at the moment," she said, "but I'm fine. I'm making arrangements." After she hung up, she called her friend Dara. Dara Chen had been Evelyn's closest friend since their second year of college, when they'd been assigned to the same study group for an econometrics class, and had spent the first session arguing about methodology and the second session getting drinks and complaining about the professor. Dara now ran a boutique hedge fund in Chicago, had 2 kids, a dry sense of humor that could strip paint, and the rare quality of being exactly who she appeared to be. No layers, no performance, just a person who said what she meant and meant what she said. "The papers came," Evelyn said. A short silence, then, "Where is he now?" "Gone. Probably at the office." "Do you need me to fly in?" "Not yet. Soon, maybe, but not yet." "Evie?" Dara's voice was careful in the way it got when she was working to hold back what she actually wanted to say. "What are you going to do?" Evelyn set the envelope on the kitchen counter. She'd already decided she wasn't going to sign anything for at least 30 days, which was her legal right, and which would give her father's people time to do what they needed to do. "I'm going to find a place to live," she said. "Somewhere I picked out myself, not something he approves first. I'm going to finish this pregnancy without Adrian Mercer's money, his name, or his opinion about anything. And after that, she looked out the window again. 43 floors below, the city moved the way it always moved, indifferent, continuous, utterly unaware that anything had changed. After that, she said, I'm going to take care of my son. She hadn't told anyone the gender yet. Not deliberately, she'd simply been waiting for the right moment, the right context. This felt like it. A boy, Dara said quietly. A boy. Another pause. When Dara spoke again, her voice had shifted into something steadier. Okay, tell me what you need. Evelyn spent the rest of that Tuesday making lists. Not emotional lists. Not grieving lists. Not the kind that catalog what you've lost and let you sit with the ache of it. Practical lists. What she needed to move, what she needed to establish independently. What paperwork needed to be in her name versus what was currently joint. What deadlines she was working against given that she had approximately 7 weeks before her son arrived, and the logistical complexity of that life event was going to consume every available margin of her attention regardless of what else was happening. She packed 2 bags. Not everything. She wasn't going to move out impulsively in a way that created a legal record of abandonment that Adrian's lawyers could use against her. She packed what she needed for 2 weeks: clothes, documents, the few personal things in the apartment that were actually hers and not bought by a decorator trying to communicate a brand. She called a car service, not the account linked to Adrian's corporate card, her own. She had maintained her own accounts throughout the marriage, a habit that had occasionally puzzled Adrian and now looked like exactly the long-game instinct it had been. She left the apartment at 3 in the afternoon. She didn't leave a note. The hotel she checked into was a quiet, well-managed place on the Upper West Side. Not ostentatious, not the kind of establishment that generated gossip, the kind of place that had excellent service and very good discretion and charged appropriately for both. She'd stayed here twice before, years ago, and the manager recognized her, which under different circumstances might have been either reassuring or annoying, and on this particular Tuesday was simply a fact. Her room was on the 7th floor, clean light, good windows, a view of the street rather than another building's facade. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while after she unpacked, her hands in her lap, doing absolutely nothing. The baby moved. She put her hand on her stomach and sat with it. She wasn't crying. She had felt, earlier, standing in the kitchen with the papers in front of her, some distant precursor to grief, something that might have opened into real pain if she'd let herself stay in it. But she hadn't let herself stay in it. Not because she was suppressing anything, not because she was in shock, more because she had known, on some cellular level, for longer than she'd been willing to say out loud, that this was coming. The papers hadn't ended her marriage. They'd simply formalized what had already been true for over a year. What she felt now was something closer to clarity, uncomfortable clarity, the kind that required action rather than emotion. She ordered room service, soup, bread, something sensible that her obstetrician would approve of, and opened her laptop and started working through the list. 3 days after Evelyn left the apartment, Adrian Mercer gave his first interview since announcing the divorce. He hadn't intended to discuss it publicly. He'd made that clear through his publicist, through his communications team, through the various gatekeepers whose job it was to control his narrative. But at the end of a profile piece for a business publication, a piece ostensibly about Mercer Technologies' upcoming product launch, the reporter had asked, and Adrian, who had been in an excellent mood that afternoon, had answered. Evelyn and I want different things, he said. We've known that for a while. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is acknowledge that cleanly. The quote ran under the headline, Mercer on divorce. The most respectful thing. Dara Chen sent Evelyn a screenshot at 11 o'clock that night with a single line of text. He said that out loud. To a journalist. About his pregnant wife. Evelyn read it, set her phone face down on the nightstand, and went to sleep. She was past the point of being surprised by what Adrian did in public. She was also past the point of needing him to be different than he was. The grief of that, the private, real grief of loving someone who turned out to be incapable of loving you back the way you needed, was something she was processing slowly, in small increments, in the quiet hours before sleep. It wasn't clean, it wasn't resolved. Some morning she woke up and the weight of it was still there, solid and specific, the ache of 5 years ending in a manila envelope and a post-it note. But it was separate from what she was doing now. She'd learned to keep those two things separate: the emotional reality of loss and the practical reality of what needed to happen next. Her mother had taught her that, inadvertently, by failing to do it herself. She was not her mother. The first call her father made was to a man named Elliot Crane. Elliot Crane was 55 years old, had spent 30 years in institutional finance, and had worked with the Ashford family for so long that he'd stopped thinking of it as working with them, and had started thinking of it as simply what he did, the way a person stops thinking of breathing as a choice. He managed the most significant piece of what Charles Ashford's family office did, the piece that was not public, not because it was illegal, but because it was old, structured around agreements that predated many of the disclosure regulations that govern more visible investment vehicles, and because Charles Ashford had always believed that the most powerful thing a person could possess was information that other people didn't know you had. The Ashford family had a position in Mercer Technologies, not a large one, not one that appeared on any standard ownership registry at a level that triggered mandatory disclosure, but it was there, and it was real. And it had been accumulated quietly over 2 years through a series of accounts managed by entities that bore no obvious relationship to the Ashford name. It was there because Charles Ashford, 4 years ago, had shaken his son-in-law's hand at a dinner in Midtown and thought, "This man will hurt my daughter," and had then gone home and spent the following 3 months having his people build a very careful, very patient, very quiet position in the company his daughter's husband had built. Not to destroy it, to protect his daughter. The distinction mattered to him. It still did. But the phone call his daughter had made on a Tuesday morning in March had changed the parameters. She wasn't asking for protection anymore. She was asking for something else, and he was ready to provide it. Evelyn's lawyers, her own, hired independently, paid from her own account, filed a formal response to the divorce petition 11 days after the papers arrived. The response was not contentious. It did not threaten. It did not make dramatic claims or seek emergency injunctions or any of the aggressive legal maneuvers that Adrian's team had presumably braced for. It simply requested, politely, a 60-day extension of the response deadline, citing the advanced stage of the respondent's pregnancy and the medical necessity of ensuring that no major legal proceedings disrupted her prenatal care during the final trimester. It was entirely reasonable. It was also, from a strategic standpoint, exactly what she needed. 60 days gave her time. Time to settle into the apartment she'd found, her own, in her own name, in a building she'd chosen on a street she liked, with light that came in from the south and a small outdoor space where she was already imagining a garden. Time to let her father's people finish what they'd started. Time to have her son. Adrian's lawyers pushed back on the extension, politely, professionally, and unsuccessfully. The judge granted it without comment. Adrian texted her that evening. "My lawyers tell me the extension was approved. Fine. But we need to talk about the financial terms before you get any ideas." She read it once. Didn't reply. She'd stopped explaining herself to him a long time ago. There was nothing he needed to know about her ideas, her plans, or what she was building in the quiet days before everything became visible. She had learned patience from her father. She had learned discretion from her mother. And from her own particular experience of the past 5 years, she had learned something maybe more valuable than either, that the people who underestimated you always gave you the most room to move. Adrian had underestimated her since approximately the 2nd year of their marriage, when the company had taken off and he'd started thinking of her less as a partner and more as a pleasant feature of his life, present, low maintenance, unlikely to surprise him. She was going to surprise him, not in anger, not out of revenge, not out of the particular bitterness that came from loving someone who'd discarded you. She was going to surprise him because it was the right thing to do, for herself and for the son she was bringing into the world, and because the life she'd walked away from 6 years ago had not gone anywhere while she was gone. It had simply been waiting. On the 42nd day after the divorce papers arrived, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, Evelyn Ashford went into labor. She called Dara, who had been in New York for 2 weeks, and answered on the first ring, abandoning the hotel room sleep she'd been fighting for since midnight. She called Dr. Mehta, who said, "I'll meet you there." She called the car service, again, her own account, and sat on the edge of her bed in the apartment she'd chosen herself, in the pale yellow lamplight, breathing through contractions that were still manageable but clearly had no intention of remaining that way. She did not call Adrian. She had thought about it, in the abstract way you think about obligations, Not because she wanted him there, not because she thought his presence would make anything better, but because the child was his, and there was a version of this where you made the call as a formality, as the fulfillment of some basic contractual human decency. She had thought about it and decided against it. He had made his choices in March. He didn't get to walk back into this room because it had become inconvenient to be absent. That was her choice, and she made it without guilt and without ceremony and without the need to explain it to anyone. At 6:43 that Sunday morning, in a room at the hospital with Dara on her left and Dr. Mehta on her right, with the early light beginning to move across the floor, her son was born. She had already chosen his name. James Charles Ashford. Not Mercer. Ashford. She had made that decision 3 weeks earlier, quietly, in the way she made most decisions that mattered, after sitting with it long enough to be certain, and then moving forward without fanfare. James Charles Ashford weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces, and arrived in the world with what Dr. Mehta described, professionally, as a vigorous cry. Evelyn held him, and did not think about Adrian. She thought about the south-facing windows in her apartment, and the garden she was going to plant, and the particular quality of light on a Tuesday morning when everything changes, and the world, which has no interest in your grief, simply continues. She thought about her father's voice on the phone, already working on it. She thought about the 60-day extension, which had expired 4 days ago without her signing anything. She thought about the fact that in approximately 6 weeks, when she was clear-eyed and recovered, and her son was sleeping in the way that newborns eventually learn to sleep, she was going to walk back into the world she'd stepped away from. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just present, fully, completely, without apology, the way she should have been all along. James opened his eyes. Dark, unfocused, blinking against the light. The particular gaze of someone who has just arrived somewhere entirely new and is trying to make sense of the dimensions. "Hi," she said. He blinked. Outside, the city moved the way it always did. Traffic and light, and the morning arriving with its usual indifference to what had happened inside this room. But something had shifted. She could feel it, not metaphorically, not as a story she was telling herself, but as a physical reality, the way the air in a room changes when someone walks in who changes everything. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. She didn't look at it. Whatever it was, it could wait. She had more important things right now. James was 6 days old when Adrian Mercer finally called. Evelyn was sitting in the armchair by the south-facing window when her phone lit up. The one she'd moved from the bedroom into the living room because the light was better there, and James seemed to settle more easily when he could feel the warmth of it on his face. She was holding him in the particular way Dr. Mehta had shown her, the one that supported his head without making it feel like a hostage situation, and she was not thinking about Adrian or the divorce or any of it. She was thinking about the fact that her son's fingernails were very small and appeared to require trimming, and she had absolutely no idea how to trim the fingernails of a 6-day-old human being without genuine catastrophe. The phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Adrian. She let it ring. Not out of cruelty. She simply wasn't ready to have that conversation with a newborn in her arms and 4 hours of sleep behind her, and the particular emotional rawness of early postpartum, sitting on her like weather she couldn't dress for. James stirred, but didn't wake. She kept her hand on his back and waited until the buzzing stopped. He didn't leave a voicemail. She hadn't expected him to. Well, he tried again the next morning. This time she answered, partly because Dara had gone back to Chicago, and the apartment was very quiet, in a way that was either peaceful or unbearable, depending on what minute it was, and partly because the conversation had to happen at some point, and postponing it was starting to feel like its own kind of exhaustion. "I heard," Adrian said. His voice was careful, not warm. Adrian's voice almost never ran warm, the way some people's naturally did, but careful in the specific way of a person who had prepared for this call and was trying to execute it correctly. "Is the baby all right? Are you all right?" "We're fine," she said. "His name is James." A pause. "James?" "James Charles Ashford." The pause this time was longer. She could hear him processing it. The name, the specific choice of last name, what that meant legally and symbolically, and in terms of the narrative he'd been constructing about this divorce in interviews and conversations with his board, and probably inside his own head where he was, as always, the protagonist. "Evelyn, I'm not going to debate the name with you, she said. Not sharp, just even. He's my son. That's his name. Another silence. Then, my lawyers are going to have questions about the birth certificate. Your lawyers can call my lawyers. She shifted James to her other arm. He made a small sound and then went back to sleep with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had recently decided sleep was the most important project. Is there something specific you wanted, Adrian, or did you call to audit the paperwork? He didn't answer that. Instead, I want to be involved. Whatever you think of me right now, he's my son too. It was, she had to acknowledge, not the worst thing he could have said. It was also exactly the kind of statement that was difficult to argue with and that committed him to very little. I want to be involved was not the same as I will show up when it's hard, or I understand what I did, or even I'm sorry. But it was a beginning of something, and she was too tired and too careful to dismiss it entirely. Then we'll discuss a schedule, she said. Through the lawyers, the way we agreed. The lawyers make everything take longer. Yes, she said. They do. She hung up. James opened one eye, regarded her with an expression of profound indifference, and closed it again. I know, she said to him. I know. The first indication that something was happening in the market came 4 weeks after James was born. It didn't come from her father directly. Charles Ashford communicated in increments, offering information the way a careful card player set down cards, only what was needed and only when it was. It came from Elliot Crane, who called Evelyn on a Friday afternoon with the particular tone of a man who has something significant to report and is trying to decide how much weight to put on it. There's been movement, Elliot said. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a spreadsheet open on her laptop. She'd been reviewing financial documents for the first time since James arrived, slowly rebuilding the operational part of her brain that the fog of early parenthood had temporarily covered. What kind of movement? Mercer Tech stock. Someone's been accumulating, slowly, carefully, through several different vehicles. Nothing that triggers mandatory disclosure individually, but your father's people have been watching the aggregate, and the picture is... He paused. Notable. How much? He gave her a number. She looked at her cold coffee for a moment. That's not my father. No, Elliot said. That's not your father. She sat up straighter. Who? We're still working on that. The structures are clean. Whoever is doing this knows exactly where the disclosure lines are and has stayed precisely below them on every single vehicle. That's not amateur work. No, she said. It's not. After she hung up, she sat for a while with the information. The baby monitor on the table beside her emitted the soft crackling sound of James breathing in his crib in the next room, steady, reliable, the most reassuring sound she knew. Someone was moving on Adrian's company. Someone who wasn't her father, who wasn't her, who had been watching Mercer Technologies long enough to build a position with this kind of care. The timing, weeks after the divorce filing became public, weeks after Adrian had given his interview about respectful decisions, was not coincidental. In finance, nothing was ever coincidental. Everything was a signal, if you knew how to read it. She opened a new tab on her laptop and started pulling the public filings. Adrian Mercer had built Mercer Technologies over 9 years from a 2-person operation. Himself and a software engineer named Greg Haynes, who'd left for a competitor in year 3 and was now, in the way of former co-founders, both wealthy and occasionally resentful, into a publicly traded company with a market capitalization that had crossed $8 billion the previous October and was currently sitting, after a Q4 earnings report that had been slightly below analyst expectations, at around 7.2. The company's structure was clean on paper. Adrian held approximately 18% of shares directly, making him the largest individual holder. Institutional investors held another 40% collectively. The rest was distributed among employees, smaller individual investors, and a handful of venture funds that had come in during the early rounds and had been slowly, methodically liquidating their positions over the past 2 years as the company matured. What this meant, practically, was that Adrian's control of the company, his ability to set direction, to make major decisions, to remain as CEO without meaningful challenge, depended not on his ownership stake alone, but on the relationships he maintained with his board and on the continued alignment of his institutional investors with his vision for the company. He was not, in the technical sense, unassailable. He was protected by relationships and reputation and the inertia of success. Inertia, Evelyn thought, was a powerful force until something interrupted it. She spent 2 evenings going through the filings, making notes in the clean, deliberate hand she'd developed over years of doing this kind of work in a different context. She wasn't trying to understand everything yet. She was trying to understand the shape of it, where the vulnerabilities were, where the assumptions lived, where someone might push if they wanted to destabilize the structure without announcing themselves. When she finished, she called her father. "The undisclosed accumulation," she said without preamble. "Do you know who it is?" "We have a strong hypothesis," Charles said. "Tell me." "A fund called Sentinel Capital, private, founded 4 years ago and largely under the radar. They specialize in what they prefer to call operational transformation investments, which is a polished way of saying hostile acquisition of companies whose leadership has become a liability to shareholder value." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. They think Adrian has become a liability. They think the divorce has created a window. The Q4 miss gave them an opening, and the interview, her father paused. The interview didn't help. The interview, the most respectful thing you can do. She'd read the full piece twice, not to wound herself, but to understand the gap between the person she'd married and the person being quoted. It was considerable. What does Sentinel want? They want the company, not to run it. They don't operate companies. They want to restructure it, extract value, replace leadership with someone they control, and position for a sale within 3 years. That would destroy what Adrian built. Yes, Charles said. It would. She stood at the window. Across the street, a woman was walking a dog. Small, impractical, wearing a coat that matched its owner's jacket in a way that was either intentional or a remarkable coincidence. The street was damp from rain earlier. The light was that particular gray that meant the afternoon had given up on itself. "We're not going to let that happen," she said. Her father's voice was careful. "Evelyn, I know what it is," she said. "I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for the people who work there. 4,000 employees, Dad. And I'm doing it because if my son is going to grow up knowing his father built something, it should still exist." A long pause. "You've been thinking about this." "I've had 6 weeks," she said. "James sleeps a lot." The call Evelyn made the following Monday morning was to a woman named Patricia Hollis. Patricia Hollis was 62 years old, had spent the first 20 years of her career as a corporate attorney specializing in securities law, and had spent the subsequent 20 years deploying that expertise in ways that were considerably more aggressive and considerably more interesting than private practice. She worked, as of the past decade, almost exclusively with the Ashford family office in a capacity that defied clean description, but that Evelyn had always privately thought of as the person you called when you needed someone who had read every legal document that could possibly be relevant and had strong opinions about all of them. "I need a shareholder rights review," Evelyn said. "Specifically, I need to understand the voting structure, any blocking rights, and anything in the original articles of incorporation that the current board might have forgotten about." Patricia's voice was dry. "Mercer Technologies." "Yes. I've been expecting this call for about 3 weeks." Evelyn smiled, which was the first time she'd smiled about any of this. "Were you?" "Your father is not subtle when he's waiting for something," Patricia said. "He gets very quiet. I've learned to interpret the quiet. What have your people found?" "Nothing catastrophic from your perspective." "The sound of papers, actual papers, because Patricia famously distrusted digital documents for anything sensitive. The original articles include a provision for shareholder-elected board representation that was structured with enough flexibility that it's never been exercised but is absolutely still valid. If you accumulate enough voting shares to trigger it, and if your position is structured correctly, you can nominate a board member without going through the standard proxy process. "How much do we need?" Patricia gave her a number. Evelyn looked at the spreadsheet on her screen, the one she'd been building for the past 2 weeks, quietly, methodically, across the particular hours when James was asleep and the apartment was still. "We're about 60% of the way there." "I know," Patricia said. "We've been watching." Adrian noticed the stock movement on a Wednesday, which meant his team had been watching it for at least a week and had been trying to figure out whether to tell him. That was the thing about very successful people who had built a culture of caution around them. Their teams learned to deliver bad news late and incomplete, in the hope that it would look less bad by the time it arrived. It rarely did. His chief financial officer, a careful man named Douglas Webb, who had been with the company for 6 years and had the manner of someone perpetually bracing for the floor to drop, came into his office at 11 in the morning with the expression of a person carrying something fragile. "We need to talk about some unusual trading patterns," Douglas said. Adrian looked up from his laptop. He'd been reviewing the deck for the product launch in 2 weeks, a major announcement, the kind that was supposed to reset the narrative after the Q4 stumble and the divorce coverage that had been, despite his best efforts, more visible in business media than he'd anticipated. How unusual? Douglas set a printed report on the desk. Adrian looked at it. His expression didn't change. It rarely did, which was either a strength or a pathology depending on who was observing, but something shifted slightly around his eyes. "Someone's accumulating," he said. "Multiple vehicles, staying below individual disclosure thresholds, but when you aggregate, I can see what it looks like when you aggregate." Adrian stood up. He had the habit, when he was processing something unpleasant, of walking to the window, his 43rd floor window, the one with the view of the city that he'd had photographed for 3 separate magazine profiles. He stood there now, hands in his pockets. "Do we know who it is?" "Not yet. The structures are clean." "Clean," Adrian repeated. He was quiet for a moment. "Hostile?" "The pattern is consistent with a slow accumulation ahead of a proxy action," Douglas said. "But we can't confirm hostile," Adrian said again, flatly, in the voice he used when he was no longer asking questions but filing information. He stood at the window for a while longer. Below, the city moved with its usual indifference. He thought about the Q4 numbers, which he still believed were an outlier rather than a trend. He thought about the product launch in 2 weeks, which was going to be excellent and which was going to reset everything. He thought about Evelyn, which surprised him. The thought arrived without invitation, the way uncomfortable things did. He hadn't spoken to her since the call the week after James was born. She'd been even and unreachable in that particular way she had when she'd already made up her mind about something and was simply waiting for you to catch up. He hadn't been able to catch up because he didn't know what she was thinking, which was a problem he hadn't anticipated when he'd had his lawyers draft the papers. He'd assumed the divorce would be quiet. She was a quiet person, contained, controlled, private. He'd assumed she'd take the settlement and step back. She hadn't signed the settlement. He'd filed it away as stubbornness, as the particular irrationality of a woman managing grief. Now, standing at the window with Douglas's report in his hand, something else began forming in the back of his mind. Not a complete thought, not yet, just the early architecture of unease. "Double the monitoring," he said, "and get me a meeting with the board chair this week." "He's in London." "Get me a meeting." Cassandra Voss heard about the unusual trading activity from Douglas Webb, which was not particularly surprising. Douglas had a habit of sharing information laterally, rather than strictly upward, a useful quality in certain organizational cultures and a deeply problematic one in others. She heard about it over lunch in a restaurant 3 blocks from the Mercer building that served food so aggressively minimalist, it had always struck her as a kind of institutional hostility toward hunger. She listened to Douglas describe the patterns with an expression of appropriate concern, said the right things, asked the right questions, and spent the rest of the lunch eating her very small portion of extremely expensive fish while thinking about a phone call she'd had 8 days earlier. The call had been from a man named Warren Lyle. Lyle was a managing partner at Sentinel Capital. She'd met him 2 years ago at a conference in Scottsdale, had stayed in occasional contact, the kind of contact that existed just below the threshold of anything professionally meaningful. A text here, a LinkedIn comment there, the particular low-grade networking that people in adjacent worlds maintained in case it became useful. It had become useful. Lyle had called her to ask, in general terms that were clearly serving as a structure for specific terms, what she thought about the leadership culture at Mercer Technologies, about Adrian specifically, about whether the board had genuine oversight or whether they were largely deferential, about whether the company's current direction reflected a sustainable vision or the priorities of a single individual who had become, in Lyle's careful phrasing, somewhat disconnected from the fundamentals. She had answered carefully. Honestly, for the most part, she was too intelligent to lie to someone who might eventually be in a position of authority over her. She had said that the culture was strong in some areas and brittle in others. She had said that the board was independent in the formal sense, but had not, to her observation, ever meaningfully challenged the CEO on a strategic decision. She had said that she thought the company had significant unrealized value. What she had not said was that she was unhappy, that she'd believed 2 years ago that her relationship with Adrian, which was real, whatever people thought about it, was going to mean something professionally, was going to translate into the kind of partnership she'd been building toward. That she'd been wrong about that she'd watched him, over the past 6 months, make decisions that prioritized optics over substance and manage her contributions in ways that kept her visible enough to be useful and constrained enough not to be threatening. She hadn't said any of that to Lyle, because she wasn't a person who disclosed vulnerabilities to potential allies before she understood the terms. But she had said, "I think there are people at this company who would welcome fresh perspective at the leadership level." Lyle had said, "That's good to know." She turned her phone over on the restaurant table now, face down, and finished her fish. The thing about positions was that they were only positions until something moved. She had been holding hers for long enough. The question was what moved first, and whether she was on the right side when it did. 6 weeks after James was born, Evelyn went back to work. Not to an office. She didn't have one yet, not in the formal sense. She worked from the apartment, from the kitchen table or the armchair by the window, depending on whether James was in the bouncer, or the crib, in increments between feeds and naps, and the particular administrative chaos of a newborn schedule, which was either completely random or subject to a logic she hadn't decoded yet. Dara had sent her a book about infant sleep patterns. She had read it and concluded that the author had clearly never personally experienced an infant. What she was doing in those hours when James slept was not, technically, her work in the sense that it appeared on any official record. She was reviewing. She was analyzing. She was having conversations with Patricia Hollis and Elliot Crane, and occasionally her father, building a comprehensive picture of Mercer Technologies' ownership structure and the specific path she intended to take through it. The path was elegant, she thought, not in the self-congratulatory way, she was too honest with herself for that, but in the sense that it was clean. It used existing structures. It relied on no illegality, no deception, no drama. It required only patience and precision, which were the two things she had most reliably in supply. She had begun to execute it 3 weeks ago. The Ashford family office held, through the various vehicles her father had been building for 4 years, a position in Mercer Technologies that was now approaching the threshold required under the original Articles of Incorporation. She was not going to hold all of it herself. Some of it would remain under existing structures. But through a series of transfers and reassignments, all legal, all documented, she was bringing her personal ownership stake to a number that would make what came next possible. She had not told Adrian any of this. She was not required to. The product launch happened on a Thursday in a conference room in the Mercer building that had been set up with the kind of expensive minimalism that signaled "we are confident" rather than "we are trying." 60 journalists, analysts, and partners. A presentation that Adrian had rehearsed 14 times, by Cassandra's count, because she'd been in the building every one of those mornings and had listened to the same 6-minute opening from her office next door. It went well. Adrian was excellent at this. She'd always acknowledged that, even now, even knowing what she knew about what Lyle's people were planning, he had a presence that commanded rooms without appearing to work at it, a clarity of delivery that made complex ideas feel accessible, and the particular magnetism of someone who genuinely believed in what he was saying. She had loved that quality once. She still respected it, in the detached way you could respect something you'd decided to work against. The coverage the next day was largely positive. The stock moved up 3% on the open. Adrian called her into his office that afternoon, which he rarely did in a way that wasn't coordinated through his assistant. He was in a good mood, the particular elevated energy of someone who had pulled off something they'd been anxious about. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she agreed. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the expression he sometimes got, direct, assessing. The one that had, early on, felt like being seen and now felt like being evaluated. "You've been quiet this week." "I've been busy." "The accumulation story is getting around. Some of the analysts are asking questions." He paused. "I'd like to stay ahead of it. Control the narrative before it becomes noise." What kind of narrative are you thinking? That we're aware of it. It doesn't concern us. The fundamentals are strong. He spread his hands. Simple. Simple, she repeated. I want you to draft something for the investor relations team. Talking points. Something that projects calm without looking like we're managing perception. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll have something to you by end of day. She wrote the talking points. They were professional, accurate, and entirely useless against what she knew was coming, which was the kind of irony she had to be careful not to let show on her face. Warren Lyle called her that night. She was in her car, in the parking garage beneath the Mercer building, engine running, going nowhere. She picked up on the second ring. We're moving to the next phase, Lyle said. He didn't do preamble. It was, she thought, his most honest quality. I want to know if you're still in. Define the next phase. We're going to go visible. File the position, announce our stake, request a board seat. It'll trigger a public process. He paused. Things will get messy for a little while. Then they'll get better. She was quiet. Through the concrete pillar to her left, she could see the fluorescent light of the elevator bank, the yellow-white flicker that never fully resolved. What's my position in the better? We need someone inside who understands the operations, who the remaining employees will trust, who can be a face for the transition without looking like an outsider's appointment. He let that settle. You're the obvious choice. Chief executive? We'd call it interim initially, but the interim tends to last. She thought about the rehearsed product launch, the 14 mornings she'd listened to the same 6-minute opening, the conversation in the office this afternoon, control the narrative, as if the narrative were a thing that could still be controlled. I need 48 hours, she said. You have 24, Lyle said. We file Monday morning. She sat in the parked car for a long time after she hung up. The engine idled. The fluorescent light flickered. Somewhere above her, 43 floors up, Adrian Mercer's office was dark. She thought about what she wanted, really wanted, past the grievance and the ambition and the specific ache of being underestimated by someone she'd trusted. She thought about what she was willing to do to get it. Then she thought about something that hadn't occurred to her until this moment, sitting in a concrete parking garage at 9 in the evening, which was the question of who else was watching this company and whether the position she thought she was in was actually the position she was in. She got out of the car, rode the elevator up to the lobby, and took a cab to her apartment. She did not call Lyle back that night. On a Friday morning, Evelyn received a document from Patricia Hollis. It was a transfer confirmation. 14 pages, dense with legal language that most people would need an hour to parse, and that Evelyn moved through in 15 minutes, checking each clause against her own notes. When she reached the final page, the summary of what had been transferred to whom, and the resulting aggregate ownership percentage, she set the document down on the kitchen table and put her hand flat on it, palm down. James was asleep in the next room. The apartment was quiet. The transfer was complete. What she now held between her personal stake and the structures that remained under the Ashford family office, and that she could legally direct through the voting rights inherited from her mother's estate, which was the piece of this that almost no one knew, the particular provision in her mother's trust that had been drafted by an elderly attorney in Boston 40 years ago and that had sat untouched ever since like a key waiting for its lock, was enough. Not to take over, not to destroy anything, but to have a seat, a real seat, one that couldn't be managed or dismissed or politely excluded from the rooms where decisions were made. She picked up her phone and called Patricia. It's clean, she said. Every line, Patricia said. You're protected from any challenge. The provision is airtight. And the notification timeline? When do we have to? We file Monday, Patricia said. There's a window, and if we want to preserve the element of... She paused. Not surprise, but sequence. Monday, Evelyn said. Monday. She hung up. Through the monitor on the table, she could hear James stirring, the small preliminary sounds of a baby who had decided that being asleep was no longer his preferred activity. She got up to go to him, the document still on the table, 14 pages of quiet, legitimate, entirely legal transformation that Adrian Mercer would read in approximately 72 hours, and that would require him, for the first time in their marriage, to take her seriously. Not as a grievance, not as a complication, as a presence. She picked up her son, who was warm and indignant and completely uninterested in the financial architecture of what had just shifted. and she held him against her shoulder and stood by the south-facing window and let the late morning light come in. "Okay," she said, to herself more than to him. "Okay." Monday was 3 days away. The filing went in at 8:47 on Monday morning. Patricia Hollis sent Evelyn a one-line text at 8:49. "Done. Clock starts now." Evelyn was in the kitchen making oatmeal she probably wouldn't finish, James and the bouncer on the floor beside her doing the thing he'd started doing recently where he tracked movement with his eyes. Door frames, shadows, her hand reaching for the cabinet, with the focused concentration of someone learning a new language. She read the text, set her phone face down on the counter, and finished making the oatmeal. She ate half of it. The filing was a standard Section 13D disclosure, which was what you filed when your aggregate ownership in a public company crossed 5%, and your intent was anything other than purely passive investment. Patricia had drafted it with the particular precision she applied to everything, legally complete, strategically minimal, offering exactly what the regulations required, and nothing beyond that. It named Evelyn Ashford as the beneficial owner. It noted the Ashford family office structures through which portions of the position were held. It referenced in 2 concise paragraphs the shareholder rights provision in Mercer Technologies' original Articles of Incorporation that Evelyn intended to exercise. It did not, anywhere, mention Adrian Mercer's name. It did not need to. Adrian's phone started ringing at 9:14. He was in the back of a car on the way to the office when Douglas Webb called, which Douglas almost never did before 10. Adrian answered with the particular alert stillness of someone who has been half expecting a call like this without knowing exactly when it would come. "The SEC filing just hit," Douglas said. 13D. "You need to see it." "Send it to my phone." "Already sent." He read it in the car. The driver took a left on 5th and then another left onto 48th and pulled up to the Mercer building. And Adrian sat in the back seat and read the document twice while the driver waited without comment, because the driver had been with him for 4 years and understood that there were moments when the destination was not the point. Evelyn Ashford, beneficial owner. He got out of the car. He crossed the lobby. He took the elevator to 43. He walked past his assistant, who said his name once and received no response, and went into his office and closed the door. He stood at the window. Below, the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, continuous. He had stood at this window in moments of triumph and moments of pressure and the particular complicated moments that were both, and the view had always been, in some way, steadying. The reminder that the world was large and his problems were not the largest things in it. It was not steadying this morning. Evelyn Ashford. He'd been so certain she would take the settlement, so certain that the generous number his lawyers had put together would do what money usually did in these situations: absorb the injury, create a clean separation, allow both parties to move forward in parallel lines that never needed to intersect in any meaningful way. He'd been certain because he knew her, or believed he did. She was private. She was self-contained. She had never, in 5 years of marriage, done anything that could be characterized as aggressive. He was realizing now that he had confused self-containment with limitation. That quiet, in Evelyn's case, had never meant still. His phone was buzzing with messages. His board chair, who had apparently gotten to the filing even before Douglas, his general counsel, a reporter from a financial news service who had somehow already gotten his number again after he'd had it blocked twice. He ignored all of them and called one person. His personal attorney, a man named Frank Solis, who had been practicing law for 30 years and who had seen most things, picked up on the first ring. "I assume you've seen it," Adrian said. "Saw it at 9:15, Frank said. "I've been waiting for your call." "What does the provision mean, the one she's referencing?" "It means," Frank said, with the patience of a man who had been explaining legal documents to intelligent people in emotional states for 3 decades, that if her aggregate voting position reaches the threshold specified in the original articles, which, based on what's disclosed in this filing, it appears to already be approaching, she has the right to nominate a member of the board without going through the standard proxy solicitation process. That provision has never been exercised. It's never been exercised because no one has ever been in a position to exercise it. It's entirely valid. My people reviewed the articles when your company went public and flagged it as a theoretical vulnerability. We recommended strengthening the anti-dilution provisions in the next amendment window. We didn't do that. No, Frank said. We didn't. Adrian was quiet for a moment. How did she get the position? Where did the shares come from? That's the question, Frank said. The filing names her as the beneficial owner, but the structures beneath it are… A pause. Layered, sophisticated. This wasn't built in the last 2 months, Adrian. This has been in place for a while. The thing that formed in Adrian's mind then was not quite a thought and not quite a feeling, more like a pressure, something cold and specific pressing from the inside against a wall he'd been keeping up for years without knowing exactly what it was keeping out. How long? He said. Based on what's disclosed, and there may be more that isn't yet. At least 3, possibly 4 years. 4 years. 4 years ago, he and Evelyn had still been married in the full sense of the word. They'd gone to Portugal that summer, stayed in a house outside Lisbon with a courtyard and terrible Wi-Fi, argued about where to have dinner with the comfort of people who knew each other's arguments well enough to skip the pretense of listening. He'd been happy, or some version of it. He could see that now with the particular clarity of retrospect, which was always too clear and always arrived too late. 4 years ago, someone who loved his wife had started quietly building a position in his company. He sat down. Something in his chest was very heavy. Who, he said, is Charles Ashford? It took him 40 minutes to get a complete answer to that question, which was 40 minutes longer than it should have taken the research team he paid very well, and the answer, when it arrived, was not the answer he had expected. He had known, in the abstract, that Evelyn came from money. She'd mentioned her family occasionally, in the offhand way of someone who was comfortable with where they came from, but not interested in making it a centerpiece. He'd met Charles Ashford twice, the dinner in Midtown 4 years ago, and once before that, briefly, at a family gathering in Connecticut that he'd arrived late to and left early from because of a call he'd needed to take. He'd found her father pleasant and intelligent and somewhat opaque, which described a large percentage of the people in Adrian's professional orbit, and had not struck him as remarkable. He had not done a thorough background on Charles Ashford because Evelyn had not been a business transaction. He had married her. It had not occurred to him that this was a gap in his information. The summary his research team produced in 40 minutes would have taken him 4 hours to compile himself, and it still felt incomplete. A sketch rather than a portrait, because Charles Ashford did not leave much on the record to find. What was there was sufficient to establish the scale of what Adrian had missed. He read it twice, then he pushed it to the side of his desk and stared at the middle distance for a long time. He had been building a billion-dollar company while his wife was the daughter of something considerably larger and considerably older, and she had never said so, not once, not in 5 years of marriage, not in the dinner conversations and the Portugal arguments, and the 2 years when things were good, and the 2 years when they weren't, and the morning he'd walked into the kitchen and put a manila envelope on the table and left without watching her open it. She had simply been there, present, his wife. The person he'd decided was a quiet feature of his life. He thought about the post-it note. Sign these. My lawyer will be in touch. The weight in his chest got heavier. The story broke publicly at 11:40 that morning, which was fast even by the standards of financial media. The headline on the first outlet to run it was, Mercer Tech faces shareholder challenge from CEO's estranged wife, heir to Ashford investment dynasty. The word dynasty was doing a lot of work in that headline, Evelyn thought when Dara sent it to her. But it wasn't inaccurate. How are you feeling? Dara asked. They were on the phone the way they had been every day this week, Dara calling from Chicago in the margins of her own schedule, with the loyalty of a person who took friendship seriously as a commitment. Strange, Evelyn said. She was sitting on the floor of James's room, her back against the wall, watching him sleep in the crib. He'd been fussier than usual all morning and had finally gone down 40 minutes ago with the abruptness of complete exhaustion. Not bad, just strange. It's different when it's real, when it's actually out there. Are you ready for what comes next? Define what comes next. Adrian doing something stupid, Dara said. Evelyn almost smiled. I'm ready for that. I've had 5 years of practice. What she wasn't ready for, what she hadn't fully anticipated, which she acknowledged to herself with some irritation because she disliked being caught off guard even in small ways, was the volume. Not of media coverage, though that was substantial, but of calls and messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. People from the world she'd stepped back from, her parents' circles, financial people who had watched the Ashford name appear in a SEC filing and wanted to be visible to it. They were calling her assistant. She'd hired one that week, a young woman named Rachel who was organized and calm and who had taken Evelyn's instruction to screen everything with the focused competence of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of assignment. She didn't return most of the calls. The ones she did return were specific and deliberate. 3 major institutional investors in Mercer Technologies whose decisions in the coming weeks were going to matter considerably. Those conversations were brief, professional, and very carefully structured. She was not asking for anything. She was introducing herself, establishing that she was a serious participant in the company's governance, and giving the investors a reference point for who she was beyond what the media headline could tell them. All 3 conversations ended the same way, with the investor saying some version of, "We'll be watching this closely," and Evelyn saying, "That's all I'm asking." It was enough for now. Adrian called her at 4:30 in the afternoon. She let it go to voicemail, which she hadn't done since the early weeks after the divorce filing. This time it wasn't avoidance, she was in the middle of a call with Patricia. But when she saw the missed call notification afterward, she decided to wait before calling back. Give it an hour, let him be in his feelings for a little while, which was something she had almost never allowed herself to do, and which felt, now that she was doing it, less cruel than simply accurate. He called again at 5:15. She answered. "You could have told me," he said. His voice was different than she'd heard it in a long time, not the controlled, managed tone he'd been using in all their interactions since the divorce papers. Something raw, something that sounded like it had been sitting under pressure all day and had finally run out of the energy required to maintain the surface. "Told you what?" she said. "About your father. About—" He stopped. She could hear him moving, the particular restless sound of someone who couldn't stay still. "About any of it. Who you actually came from." "You never asked," she said. "That's not—" He stopped again. "I shouldn't have had to ask." "No," she said. "You shouldn't have." The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had in the last year of their marriage. Those had been hollow, empty of connection in a way that felt like a room with the furniture removed. This one had something in it. Weight. The specific gravity of 2 people who had known each other and failed each other and were now, for the first time in a long time, being honest about it. "What are you trying to do?" he said. "With the shares. With the board provision. What's the goal?" "To protect the company from Sentinel Capital," she said. A pause. "You know about Sentinel." "I've known about Sentinel for 6 weeks." "How—" He stopped himself. She could almost hear him recalibrating. "Why would you protect the company? Why would you care what happens to it after—" 4,000 people work there," she said, "and my son's father built it. Those are 2 reasons. I don't need more than that." Another silence. "I don't understand you," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It sounded, for the first time in as long as she could remember, like something genuine, admission rather than management. "I know," she said. "That was always the problem." She heard him exhale. "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now. My attorneys will be in touch with yours about the board process. Don't fight it, Adrian. It won't help you, and it won't help the company." "You're asking me to—" "I'm telling you what's going to happen," she said, not unkindly. "What happens after that depends on how you handle the next 2 weeks." She ended the call. Mutz. The board meeting was called for the following Thursday. It was not an emergency session in the formal sense. There was no crisis that required one yet, no material event that legally compelled the board to convene outside its normal schedule. But 3 of the 7 board members had called the chair independently within 24 hours of the SEC filing. And the chair, a woman named Helen Ferris, who had been on the board since the company's IPO and who had, in Evelyn's assessment, more actual independence than Adrian generally credited her with, had concluded that a conversation was necessary. Helen Ferris called Evelyn directly on Tuesday morning. Evelyn had half expected this. Helen was too pragmatic to go through the formal process of attorney-to-attorney communication when a direct call would tell her more in 10 minutes than a letter could in 10 pages. "Ms. Ashford," Helen said, "thank you for taking my call." "Of course." I want to understand your intentions directly, Helen said, not through legal documents, not through filings. What are you trying to accomplish? It was a fair question, asked in the tone of a woman who had been sitting in boardrooms long enough to recognize when something needed to be dealt with honestly rather than procedurally. I want to prevent Sentinel Capital from taking this company apart, Evelyn said. I want a board seat that reflects my ownership position, and I want the company's leadership to be accountable to its shareholders in ways that the current structure has made too easy to avoid. That's 3 things. Yes. The first one, Helen said, we agree on. Sentinel has been on my radar for 2 months. Their model is extractive. It would be bad for the company, bad for the employees, and bad for the investors who are in this for the long term. We're aligned there. The second one is a process question. You have the legal right to nominate under the provision. I've had our counsel review it. I know. The third one, Helen paused. The third one is a question about Adrian. Yes, Evelyn said. It is. Another pause, longer this time. Are you looking to remove him? Evelyn thought about how to answer, not about what the truth was. She'd been clear with herself about that for weeks, but about how to say it in a way that was accurate without being inflammatory, that established her position without foreclosing anything. I'm looking to ensure that the CEO of this company is accountable to a board that actually exercises oversight, she said finally. What happens after that depends on whether the current CEO is willing to operate in that structure. Helen was quiet for a moment, then, You're more careful than I expected. I've had time to think. I can tell. A pause. I'll see you Thursday. Adrian received the Sentinel Capital public announcement on Wednesday morning, the day before the board meeting, which meant it had been timed, and he understood immediately that it had been timed, that the sequence of the SEC filing, and now this was not coincidental, that someone inside his building had told Sentinel's people exactly when to go visible for maximum effect. The announcement was exactly what Warren Lyle had described to Cassandra in the parking garage. A formal disclosure of Sentinel's accumulated position, a request for board representation, and a public statement about the company's need for renewed strategic discipline and leadership accountability. Leadership accountability. The phrase was a knife wrapped in business language. Adrian read the statement 3 times. His hands were entirely still, which was either a sign of control or a sign that he'd moved past the kind of feeling that produced visible reactions. He wasn't sure which. He called Douglas Webb first. Who knew about Sentinel before this went public? Internally? Douglas's voice was careful. The executive team, legal, the board chair was briefed last week. Who on the executive team knew before I did? A pause that lasted slightly too long. The information was shared at the senior leadership level. Douglas. His voice was flat. I'm not asking who it was shared with procedurally. I'm asking who knew before I did and didn't tell me. Another pause. There have been conversations, Douglas said carefully, that I was not part of between Cassandra and some of the external parties involved in the accumulation analysis. Adrian said nothing for a moment. The window was in front of him, the city below. Thank you, Douglas. He ended the call. He sat at his desk for a long time. He'd known, in some peripheral way, that his relationship with Cassandra had costs, professional costs, the kind that came from mixing the personal and the organizational in ways that created confusion about loyalty. He'd believed those costs were manageable. He'd believed because she was smart and capable and had made herself indispensable in ways that he respected, that she was committed to what they were building together. He was now understanding, considerably less good at reading people than he'd always assumed. First Evelyn, now this. He picked up his phone and texted Cassandra. My office now, she was there in 4 minutes, which told him she'd been expecting it. She came in and sat across from him with the particular composure of a person who has decided, in advance, what version of themselves they're going to present. And he recognized it because he did the same thing himself, had always done it, had considered it a professional skill until this moment when he was on the receiving end of it, and it felt like something else entirely. You've been talking to Sentinel, he said. She didn't flinch. I have. For how long? 6 weeks. While you were in this building, while you were in my office, while you were drafting talking points for the investor relations team. He kept his voice level because raising it would have accomplished nothing, and because he was genuinely actively trying to understand before he reacted. Why? She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not defiance, something in between that was more honest than either. Because I've been watching you make decisions for 18 months that prioritized your comfort over the company's health. Because the people around you stopped telling you the truth somewhere around the second round of media profiles, and you stopped noticing. And because... She paused. Because I have spent 2 years being useful and contained and precisely as visible as you needed me to be, and no more, and I am done with that. He listened to this. There was a version of him, the version that had walked out of a kitchen in March without looking back, that would have dismissed it, filed it as disloyalty, as resentment, as the irrational complaint of someone who had wanted more than she was entitled to. That version would have gone straight to legal and treated this as a corporate governance problem to be solved. But he'd been doing a lot of sitting with uncomfortable truths lately, and the particular quality of what Cassandra was saying, the way it landed with the specific weight of something factual, made him do something he almost never did in professional confrontations, which was pause long enough to actually hear it. You think I stopped being honest with myself, he said. I think you got very good at building a version of reality that made your choices feel inevitable, she said. I think you did it with the company, and I think you did it with Evelyn, and I think you've been doing it for so long it feels like thinking clearly. He was quiet for a long time. That may be accurate, he said finally. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Small, almost invisible. Surprise, maybe. She hadn't expected him to say that. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to the board meeting tomorrow, he said, and I'm going to listen. Actually, listen. He looked at her steadily. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a moment. I told Lyle I needed 48 hours. His deadline was yesterday. Meaning you didn't give him an answer. Meaning I didn't give him an answer. He studied her face. He was trying to understand what had shifted. Whether it was the Evelyn filing, the public sentinel announcement, or something else entirely. Maybe none of those. Maybe just the particular accumulation of smaller things that eventually reached a threshold in a person. If Sentinel gets what they want, he said, you don't get what you actually want. You get what Warren Lyle decides to give you, which is different. I know that, she said. Do you? She looked away toward the window, then back. I wanted to be seen, she said, and the simplicity of it, how unguarded it was, how completely unlike the version of herself she usually presented, was, he thought, probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to him. That's a stupid reason to burn something down. It's not stupid, he said. It's just... He searched for the word. Expensive. She left his office 20 minutes later without either of them naming what came next. But something had changed. He could feel it, that particular shift in the atmosphere when two people who have been managing each other decide, even temporarily, to stop. The board meeting on Thursday was the longest 4 hours of Adrian Mercer's professional life. Helen Ferris ran it the way she ran everything, with precision and without sentimentality. The room held 7 board members, Adrian, General Counsel, and Douglas Webb. No presentation slides, no prepared remarks, just the situation on the table, which was, a major shareholder was exercising a legitimate governance right. A hostile fund was making a move, and the company's internal intelligence had apparently been compromised. Helen went through each piece systematically. She had clearly done significant work in the preceding 48 hours. Her questions were specific, her command of the details better than most of the people in the room. When she got to the internal information leak, the board's legal counsel addressed it briefly and carefully. A formal investigation was being recommended, and pending that investigation, one member of the executive team would be placed on administrative leave. Cassandra's name was not said out loud. It didn't need to be. Adrian watched the faces of the 7 board members as the investigation recommendation was discussed. Some of them he'd known for years, had recruited them, had worked alongside them, had believed he understood how they thought. He was realizing, sitting here, that understanding how someone thought in easy times was entirely different from understanding how they thought when accountability was on the table. 3 of them, he noticed, were not looking at him directly, not avoiding eye contact in the theatrical way of people with something to hide, just not quite meeting his gaze in the way that meant their assessment of him had shifted, and they hadn't yet figured out how to be in the same room with that shift. When Helen turned to the question of Evelyn's board nomination, the room was very quiet. Ms. Ashford has exercised her right under the original articles, Helen said. Our council has confirmed the provision is valid. She has nominated herself as board director. She paused. Before we discuss process, I'd like everyone here to take a breath and think about what this company actually needs right now, not what's comfortable, what's needed. One of the board members, a man named Kenneth Park, who had been on the board for 3 years and who had, in Adrian's private assessment, been the most independent of the group, said, I've had a preliminary conversation with Ms. Ashford. Heads turned. And, Helen said, and I think, Kenneth said carefully, that we may have had a significant governance gap for longer than any of us has been willing to say out loud. The room absorbed this. Adrian said nothing. He had made the decision somewhere between the call with Cassandra and the drive to this building this morning that he was going to do what Evelyn had told him to do, not fight it. Let it happen. See what was on the other side of that. It was for a person who had spent 9 years never letting anything happen to him that he hadn't engineered, an extraordinary act of restraint. He wasn't sure it was wisdom. He wasn't sure it wasn't. But he was certain, in the way you became certain about things after they had been taken apart in front of you, that fighting it would make everything worse. So he sat and he listened. Actually listened, the way Cassandra had accused him of stopping doing. The meeting ended at 3 in the afternoon. Helen Ferris walked him to the elevator, which she'd never done before. They stood together for a moment in the corridor outside the boardroom, the particular stillness of a hallway that had just held a very large amount of tension. You were quiet today, she said. I was listening. She looked at him sideways. She was in her mid-60s, small, with the kind of face that had been beautiful when she was younger, and was now something better, specific, settled, shaped by everything it had lived through. That's a change. I know. She was quiet for a moment. The DNA question, she said. I need to ask you directly. He'd been expecting this. It had been raised in the meeting carefully, in the context of a statement someone had apparently leaked to a financial blog. The suggestion, attributed to unnamed sources close to the CEO, that Adrian was planning to request a paternity test as part of the divorce proceedings. He didn't know where it had come from. He hadn't said it to anyone. But it was out there now, and it was the ugliest thing that had been attached to his name in this whole situation, and Helen was looking at him with the direct, unhurried attention of a woman who needed to know the truth of it. I didn't authorize that statement, he said. I don't know who did. But have you considered it? He held her gaze. In the worst moments, he said, when I was... He stopped. When I was looking for something that would give me leverage, yes. Helen looked at him for a long moment. Don't, she said. It was one word. No elaboration, no argument, no accompanying evidence of what it would cost him professionally. Just don't. The way a person said it when they were certain enough that they didn't need anything else. I know, he said. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. Outside the building, the city was doing what it always did in the hour before rush hour, filling up, warming its engines, preparing for the collective push toward home. He sat in the car without telling the driver where to go yet. He thought about Evelyn in the kitchen that morning in March. He'd walked in, put down the envelope, and left. He hadn't looked at her face. He'd made a decision and executed it and had not been in the room for what came after, because he never was, because the emotional aftermath of his choices was a room he'd spent years learning not to enter. He thought about James. He'd seen him once, through a window in the hospital lobby, which was its own particular punishment. The awareness that he had arranged circumstances such that he saw his son for the first time through glass, standing on the public side of a building, because the woman he'd dismissed had the right to determine the terms of that moment, and she had not, reasonably and justifiably, arranged those terms for his convenience. He thought about what Helen had said. Don't. And then he thought about the blog post and the unnamed sources, and who had access to the internal legal conversations in which, in the worst moments, yes, that possibility had been floated. His phone buzzed. A message from Frank Solis. We have a problem. Call me. He called. The blog post, Frank said. The DNA suggestion. It's moving. Major outlets are picking it up and framing it as a confirmed plan. You need a statement immediately or this becomes the story. I didn't authorize, I know you didn't, but someone inside your legal team did, and right now that distinction doesn't matter to the people running with this. What matters is what you say in the next 3 hours. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, opened them. Write me a clear denial, he said. No qualifications, no language that leaves room for interpretation. Clear denial, personal statement, under my name. Done, Frank said. What else? He thought about the board meeting, about Kenneth Park, about Helen's face in the corridor, about Cassandra's voice. I wanted to be seen, and how it had landed in him like a stone in still water, the ripples still moving. Schedule a call with Evelyn's attorneys, he said, tomorrow morning, not to fight anything, to talk about what a working relationship looks like. A silence on Frank's end that was longer than usual. You're sure? I'm sure. He ended the call. The car still hadn't moved. He told the driver to go home, his apartment, the one that was only his now, the 43rd floor space with the curated art and the view and the particular silence of a place that had been designed to impress rather than to live in. He had a lot of thinking to do tonight, the kind of thinking that had no finished product, no deliverable, no deck to show at the end of it. Just the long, uncomfortable work of understanding how you had gotten somewhere and what that meant about who you were, and whether who you were was something you were willing to continue being. It was the kind of thinking he was very bad at. He was going to do it anyway. Gut. Evelyn found out about the blog post at 6 in the evening when Rachel sent her a message with a link and a single-word note, FYI. She read the piece. It was short, sourced to 2 unnamed individuals, and it suggested that Adrian Mercer was preparing to request a paternity test in the divorce proceedings as a strategy to challenge Evelyn's shareholder position. She set the phone down. James was in the bouncer, making the concentrated face that usually preceded either a significant development or a nap, and she looked at him for a long moment, his small, perfect face, the dark eyes that were changing color as the weeks passed, the particular stubborn set of his jaw that she recognized because she'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 30 years. She picked him up. She stood by the window. She was not, she checked, falling apart. She was something else. Something cold and clear that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was adjacent to both. The particular clarity you got when someone had gone as far as they could go. She called Patricia. I've seen it, Patricia said immediately. Is it real? Is he actually planning? His public denial came out 40 minutes ago, Patricia said. Clear, unqualified, under his name. My read is he didn't authorize the original leak. Evelyn was quiet. Which means someone else did, Patricia continued. Someone who wanted this out there, who wanted the narrative. Evelyn thought about what she knew of the internal landscape at Mercer Technologies, the investigation recommendation, the unnamed executive on administrative leave, the various moving pieces of a company whose leader had spent a year believing everything was under control while the floor gradually shifted under him. It doesn't matter who did it, Evelyn said. What matters is that it's out there and it has his name on it. The denial is strong. Denials are always weaker than accusations, she said. That's just how it works. She stood at the window with James against her shoulder, looking out at the city. It was getting dark, the lights coming on in the buildings across the street, the particular blue hour that Manhattan wore better than any city she'd ever been in. She thought about what came next. Not tomorrow, not the board process, not the legal timeline. The longer thing. The shape of a life on the other side of all of this. For herself, for James, for a company that 4,000 people depended on, even for a man who had put a post-it note on a divorce petition and walked out of a kitchen while his pregnant wife stood at the stove. She wasn't there yet. She wasn't going to pretend she was. But for the first time since March, the shape of it was visible, distant, imperfect, requiring more work than she'd probably accounted for. Present. James made a sound against her shoulder, not a cry, just a sound. Something communicative in the specific private language of a person who was 10 weeks old and working very hard at being in the world. I hear you, she said. Outside, the city went on. The call between the attorneys happened on a Friday morning and lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes, which Patricia Hollis later described to Evelyn as Productive in the way that root canals are productive, necessary, painful, and you're glad when it's over. What emerged from it was not an agreement. It was a framework for an agreement, which was different, a set of shared understandings about process and timeline and what each party was and wasn't willing to do in the coming weeks. Frank Solis had come prepared, which surprised Patricia slightly, and which he relayed to Evelyn without editorializing, because Patricia was too professional to editorialize and too honest to pretend she hadn't noticed. "He's not fighting the board seat," Patricia said. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with her second coffee of the morning, James and the bouncer beside her, in the particular alert mood he had some mornings where he seemed genuinely interested in everything: the light on the wall, the sound of the coffee maker, the texture of the blanket someone had tucked around his feet. "I know," she said. "He told me he wouldn't. Telling you and instructing his attorneys are different things." "I know that too. He also wants to discuss a revised custody arrangement, something more involved than what was in the original papers." Patricia paused. "Not through the formal process yet. Informally, first. A conversation." Evelyn looked at James. He had grabbed the edge of his blanket with one fist and was examining it with the focused intensity of a researcher encountering primary source material for the first time. She thought about what it would mean for him. Not now, when he was 10 weeks old and the question was abstract, but later when it became concrete. A father who showed up versus one who didn't. "Tell them I'm open to a conversation," she said. "Not this week. Next week. After the board vote." Understood. After she hung up, she sat for a while without doing anything. Outside, the street was doing its morning routine. The dog walkers, the people with coffee cups heading toward the subway, a delivery truck double parked with its hazards blinking in the particular resigned way of delivery trucks everywhere. Ordinary. Continuous. The world moving without reference to the specific weight of what she was carrying. James made a sound. She looked at him. "I know," she said again. She'd been saying that a lot lately. It had become, she recognized, a habit, responding to him as though he was communicating something specific, something she was answering. He probably wasn't. He was 10 weeks old. But the habit felt right in a way she didn't feel the need to analyze. The formal board vote on Evelyn's directorship was scheduled for the following Wednesday. In the days between the attorney call and the vote, 3 things happened that changed the shape of everything. The first was the internal investigation report. The board had moved quickly on the recommendation from the Thursday meeting, hiring an outside firm to look at the information leak, both the leak to Sentinel Capital and the leak about the DNA test story. The firm worked over a long weekend and delivered a preliminary report on Tuesday that was, by the standards of corporate investigations, remarkably clear. The Sentinel information had moved through 2 channels, a series of encrypted messages from Cassandra Voss's work device to a contact associated with Warren Lyle's personal email, and a second channel through a junior analyst in the strategic planning department who had, it appeared, been recruited by someone outside the company to provide regular operational updates. The analyst had been at the company for 14 months. He was 26 years old and had apparently been paid a sum that, to a 26-year-old making an entry-level salary, was significant enough to override whatever professional ethics training he'd received. The DNA story was different and messier. It appeared to have originated from a conversation within the external legal team, not Frank Solis's group, but a secondary firm that had been brought in for specific portions of the divorce proceeding. One attorney, apparently acting on a misreading of Adrian's instructions, had shared the information with a contact who had passed it to the blog. The attorney's explanation, when interviewed by the investigation firm, was that he'd understood he was authorized to float the idea. He had not been authorized. The misunderstanding was either genuine or convenient, and the investigation firm noted that they could not determine which. Cassandra was informed of the findings on Monday morning and resigned by noon. She sent Evelyn a text that afternoon. Evelyn didn't have her number saved, but she recognized the 917 area code and the particular directness of the message. "I want you to know I didn't leak the DNA story. I know you have no reason to believe me, but it's true." Evelyn read it twice. Then she wrote back, "I believe you." She wasn't certain that was true, but it cost her nothing to say it, and whatever Cassandra Voss had done and not done in the past 6 months, she had also, at the point when it mattered most, not given Warren Lyle the answer he needed. That was worth something. She didn't hear back. The second thing that happened was the DNA test itself. Not the one Adrian had been rumored to be planning, that was dead, denied, and hopefully buried. A different one, requested by Evelyn's attorneys as part of the formal divorce proceeding, specifically because the paternity story had circulated enough that leaving it unaddressed created an ongoing cloud. The logic was simple. If the story was out there, the cleanest way to end it permanently was a result. Adrian had agreed immediately. Frank Solis had communicated his client's consent within 2 hours of the request. The test was conducted at a medical facility on a Tuesday afternoon. Evelyn brought James. She had not expected Adrian to be there in person. The original arrangement was for samples to be submitted independently, but when she arrived, he was in the waiting area. He was sitting in one of the institutional chairs with his coat still on, looking like a man who had arrived too early and then been unable to leave. He looked up when she came in. James was in the carrier on her chest, awake, doing his current thing of attempting to lift his head with the ambitious but imprecise energy of someone who had recently discovered gravity was a challenge. Adrian stood up. She hadn't seen him in person since before James was born. He looked different, not dramatically different, not visibly broken down or transformed in the way that emotional upheaval sometimes marked a person's face, but something in him was less armored, less composed in the particular managed way she'd grown used to. He looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." He looked at James, not the careful, assessing look she'd expected, something more unguarded than that, something that resembled, she thought, the particular nakedness of a person confronting something they'd been avoiding and finding it less manageable than the avoidance. "He's bigger than I expected," Adrian said. "He's 11 weeks old." "I know how old he is." He said it quietly, without defensiveness. Then, "Can I—" He stopped, started again. "Can I hold him?" She looked at him for a moment. There was a version of this where she said no, where she cited the legal process and the pending arrangements and the fact that they hadn't established a formal schedule yet. There was a version where she protected the moment from him, held it back, made him earn it through the proper channels. She unclipped the carrier and handed Adrian his son. He held James the way first-time fathers held newborns, with the over-careful, slightly panicked precision of someone handling something irreplaceable and unfamiliar, his big hands bracketing the small body with an awkwardness that was, she thought, one of the most honest things she'd ever seen him do. James looked up at him. Adrian looked down at James. Whatever happened in that moment, she wasn't going to name it, wasn't going to build a story around it. It was real. She watched it happen and felt something shift in her chest that was not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not anything that resolved neatly into a word. Just something loosening, something that had been very tight for a very long time. "He has your jaw," she said. Adrian exhaled. It sounded like something he'd been holding for a while. The test results came back 48 hours later, confirmed paternity. Patricia sent Evelyn a one-line message, as expected. Filing to close the paternity question permanently. Evelyn sent back, "Good." The third thing that happened before the board vote was a phone call from Warren Lyle. Not to Evelyn. She wouldn't have taken it. To her father. Charles Ashford received the call on a Tuesday afternoon and listened to it for approximately 4 minutes before saying, in the particular tone he used when he was communicating finality rather than negotiating, "I'm not going to have this conversation, Warren. Goodbye." He called Evelyn immediately after. "Lyle called you," she said because she'd been expecting it. "He's looking for a way out that doesn't humiliate him publicly. He wants to withdraw the board seat request in exchange for a commitment that Sentinel's position will be bought out at a premium." Evelyn thought about this. What premium? 12% above current market. She looked at the spreadsheet on her screen, the one she'd been building for weeks, the one that now included columns she hadn't had when she started, tracking the various pieces of what the company's governance was going to look like on the other side of all this. "That's not unreasonable." "No," her father said. "It isn't." "Is he in a position to actually withdraw, or is this a negotiating position?" "He's in a position to withdraw. Sentinel's strategy depends on internal chaos. The investigation report, the Cassandra resignation, the DNA result, the narrative isn't cooperating. If he goes to a proxy fight now, he's going to lose." She was quiet for a moment. "I want it documented. The withdrawal, the buyout terms, a covenant that Sentinel doesn't rebuild a position for 5 years. I'll have Patricia draft it." "And Dad?" She paused. Thank you. For the 4 years. For waiting. A pause on his end. Her father was not a man who was comfortable with direct emotional acknowledgement, not because he didn't feel things, but because he'd spent a lifetime in environments where feeling things was something you kept private. But she could hear something in the silence. I told you when you were 17, he said finally, that the worst thing you could do was waste your ability on someone else's vision of what you should be. You didn't waste it, you just held it for a while. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The board meeting on Wednesday was shorter than the previous one, 1 hour and 40 minutes compared to 4, which meant either that things had gotten simpler or that the people in the room had already done their deciding and were performing a process they'd already concluded. Evelyn attended in person. She had been in this building twice before, once to drop off Adrian's coat 3 years ago, and once for a company holiday event in the first year of their marriage, when the company had been smaller and the party had been held in the main conference room instead of a rented venue. She'd stood in this lobby before. It felt different now. Not larger or more imposing, just differently weighted, the way a room could hold a different meaning depending on what you were in it to do. Helen Ferris met her in the lobby. Helen was dressed the way she always dressed, conservatively, precisely, with one piece of jewelry that was either expensive or very good at appearing to be. And she looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone who had processed a great deal of information about this moment and had arrived at a conclusion she was keeping private for now. Ready? Helen said. Yes, Evelyn said. She was wearing a dark blazer she'd bought the previous week. Not new. She didn't buy things new for the sake of marking occasions, but carefully chosen. She'd thought about what to wear with the same analytical attention she gave to everything else, which was to say she'd thought about what she actually wanted to communicate rather than what she wanted to appear to communicate. She wasn't here to announce herself. She was here to work. The boardroom was the same room she'd read about in the investigation report, 7th floor, west side, glass wall overlooking a terrace that was currently empty in the March cold. 7 board members, Adrian at one end of the table, general counsel, and an outside attorney at a side table. The room smelled like the specific combination of expensive coffee and collective tension that boardrooms developed over long, important meetings. Every person in the room looked at her when she came in. She sat in the seat Helen directed her to, across the table from Adrian, which she noted without reacting to, and she set her materials in front of her and looked at the room with the level attention of someone who had prepared for this and was not performing preparedness. Adrian looked at her. She met his eyes. He didn't look away. Neither did she. It lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. Not a confrontation, not a communication of anything specific. Just 2 people acknowledging each other across a table that held the structure of what they were building in the absence of what they'd had. Helen called the meeting to order. The vote on Evelyn's board seat was 7-0, not 6-1, not 5-2. 7-0, which included Adrian's vote, which he cast without comment and without visible hesitation, and which Kenneth Park, seated to Evelyn's left, noted in the board minutes with a formality that understated considerably what it represented. After the vote, the meeting continued with the Sentinel matter, the internal investigation findings, and the administrative actions that followed from both. Cassandra's resignation was formally accepted. The junior analyst had already been terminated. The secondary legal firm had been dismissed. A set of information security recommendations from the outside investigation firm were reviewed and approved for immediate implementation. Then Helen moved to the question of executive leadership. She had prepared a brief presentation, not long, not theatrical, just a clean summary of the board's responsibilities under the current circumstances and the key questions they needed to answer. The company's stock had dropped 11% in the 2 weeks since the SEC filing and the Sentinel announcement. Institutional investors were watching closely. There were 3 pending decisions that required CEO-level authority, and that had been in a holding pattern for 3 weeks because the environment had made it impossible to move them forward. "We need stability," Helen said. "Real stability, not announced stability. The difference is that one requires action and one requires a press release." She looked down the table. "I want to hear from everyone." Kenneth Park spoke first. He laid out, carefully and without personal animus, what he thought the company needed in a leadership structure for the next 12 months. A CEO with unambiguous board confidence, a clear accountability framework that hadn't existed before, and a public narrative that shifted the story from personal drama to institutional recovery. Two other board members echoed this in different language. A third raised specific concerns about the upcoming earnings call in 6 weeks and what it would require of leadership to manage investor expectations. Adrian listened to all of it. He had come to this meeting having done, as he'd told himself in the car on Thursday night, the long, uncomfortable thinking. He'd spent the weekend in a way he almost never spent weekends, not working, not strategizing, not producing anything that could be pointed to as output. He'd sat with what he knew and what he'd refused to know, and the considerable gap between them. He'd called his younger sister in Cincinnati, who he hadn't spoken to in 4 months, for reasons that were neither dramatic nor justified. He'd eaten food he'd cooked himself badly in the apartment kitchen that had been designed by someone who intended it for photographs rather than cooking. He had, in some small way that he couldn't have articulated cleanly, started trying to be a person again rather than a position. When Helen finally turned to him, the room was very quiet. "Adrian," she said, "what do you want to say?" He'd thought about this. He'd written notes, crossed them out, written different notes, and finally put the notebook away and decided he was going to say what was true rather than what was measured. "I want to say," he began, "that I have spent 9 years building something I believe in. And I want to say that a significant portion of the last 2 years, I was building something else at the same time. A version of myself that was protected from accountability in ways that I told myself were necessary and that were actually just comfortable." He paused. "I made decisions, professional and personal, that I believed were clear-eyed, and that I understand now were not. I hurt people in ways that were real. And I've been sitting with that." The room was still. "What I want to say about the company," he continued, "is that it can survive this. It has the people, the technology, and the financial position to come through a rough quarter and a governance crisis and be stronger for having fixed what was broken. I believe that." He paused again. "What I'm less certain about is whether I'm the right person to lead that recovery. And for the first time in 9 years, I'm willing to sit with that uncertainty instead of resolving it in my favor before anyone has a chance to say otherwise." Helen looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said quietly, "is the most honest thing you've said in this room in 3 years." No one laughed, but something in the room shifted slightly, a release of something that had been held. The board did not vote to remove Adrian that day. What they voted on instead was a new accountability structure, a formal CEO evaluation process with quarterly reviews, an expanded audit committee with Evelyn's involvement, and a 6-month performance framework with explicit metrics tied to leadership compensation. It was, in the language of corporate governance, a structured probation. In human terms, it was a last chance extended by people who had not entirely given up. Adrian accepted it without negotiation. After the meeting, Evelyn was in the hallway waiting for the elevator when Adrian caught up to her. He was not his usual self in any externally visible way. He still moved through a room with the same contained energy, still wore the same kind of suit, still had the same face. But something in the quality of his attention had changed, and she noticed it the way you noticed weather that had shifted while you were inside. "Can I walk with you?" he said. She considered it. To the lobby. They walked toward the elevator together. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The hallway was empty. Everyone else had filtered out toward their respective next obligations, and they were briefly, incongruously, alone. "The custody conversation," he said. "Next week, like you said." "Yes." "I want to be involved." He paused. "I said that before. On the phone, when James was a week old. I know it didn't mean much then." "It means something now if you actually do it," she said. "That's the only measure." "I know." They reached the elevator. She pressed the button. "You didn't have to vote yes," she said. "On the board seat, you could have abstained. Abstaining would have been the same as no." "I know. That's why I said it." He looked at her, the direct, focused look she'd first found compelling, and later found exhausting, and that now seemed, in this context, simply like what it was, a person trying to see something clearly. "I didn't know who you were," he said, "and I don't mean your father or the money. I mean—" He stopped, tried again. "I decided who you were, and then I stopped looking." The elevator arrived, the doors opened, she stepped in, and then turned to face him from inside it, her hand on the door sensor so it stayed open. "I know," she said. "I watched you do it." He held her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, not with the practiced PR-managed quality of apology that she'd heard from him before when things had gone wrong in smaller ways. Something less finished, more unresolved, and therefore, she thought, more real. She didn't say it was fine because it wasn't. She didn't say she forgave him because that was a word that required more distance than she currently had. She said, "I know you are." And then she let the door close. The Sentinel withdrawal was filed on Friday afternoon. The terms Patricia had drafted were accepted with minimal pushback. Lyle had, as her father had assessed, run out of runway. Without internal chaos to amplify, without the optics of a company in leadership crisis, without Cassandra Voss providing operational intelligence, the hostile position was expensive and unwinnable. He took the 12% premium and the 5-year covenant and filed a brief public statement that described Sentinel's decision as a strategic portfolio reallocation, which was the financial sector's way of saying they'd lost and were leaving before it became more embarrassing. The stock moved up 6% on the announcement. Douglas Webb sent Evelyn a data summary without editorial comment, just numbers, clean and factual, and she read it at the kitchen table with James asleep in the next room and rain coming down outside the window in the particular heavy way of late March. The sky finally deciding to do something definitive about the winter it had been putting off ending. She called her father. "It's done," she said. "I saw the filing," he said. "How are you feeling?" She thought about that, really thought about it, in the way she'd been making herself do lately. Not the automatic fine, the reflexive okay, but the actual inventory of what was present in her right now. "Tired," she said. "Still. Like I've been running at a certain pace for a long time, and the pace hasn't quite figured out it can slow down yet." "That takes a while," he said. "I know." She looked at the rain on the window. "Are you coming to visit? James is changing every week. He's—" She paused, surprised by the particular quality of what she felt saying this. "He's really something, Dad." A pause on his end, the same kind of weighted pause he'd had on the phone in March, when she'd told him it was time. Then, "I'll be there Thursday." "Good." After she hung up, she sat for a while listening to the rain, not thinking about anything in particular, or thinking about everything at a level below language, below strategy, in the pre-verbal register of someone who had been operating at high altitude for long enough that the simple act of sitting still felt like its own kind of work. The first board meeting she attended as a director was 2 weeks later. It was smaller than the vote meeting, 3 agenda items, 2 hours, the regular operational rhythm of a board that was rebuilding its habits from the ground up. Helen ran it differently than before, she noticed. More space for questions, less deference to the CEO to set the agenda, a different distribution of who spoke when. Evelyn spoke 3 times. Not to dominate, she was the newest person in the room, and she had more to learn about the operational reality of the company than any governance document could teach her. She spoke to ask specific questions about the 3 pending decisions that had been in limbo, a partnership agreement, a capital allocation choice, and an HR policy that had been flagged in the investigation report as contributing to the culture of inadequate internal communication. Each time she spoke, the room listened with the particular attentiveness people gave to someone whose position was new, but whose preparation was clearly not. Adrian answered her questions directly. Not defensively, not with the managed quality she'd braced for. He answered the way someone answered when they were trying to get something right, rather than trying to win. After the meeting, Helen found her in the hallway. "First board meeting," Helen said. "First board meeting." "How was it?" Evelyn considered. "Better than I expected." Which might just mean I expected the worst. Helen smiled. A small, specific smile that reached her eyes. That's usually the safest approach. They walked toward the elevator together. Helen pressed the button. "I want to tell you something that I don't say often," she said, "because I find it generally creates the wrong kind of expectations." Evelyn waited. "You're going to be good at this," Helen said. "The governance work, the oversight function. You have the right combination of patience and precision, and—" She paused. "You care about the right things. That's rarer than it sounds." Evelyn thought about how to receive this. She was not by nature a person who accepted praise easily. She'd been raised by a man who expressed approval through the quality of his attention rather than the content of his words, and her instinct was always to be skeptical of compliments, to wonder what they were in service of. But Helen Ferris was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. Evelyn had understood that from the first phone call. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. 3 weeks after the Sentinel withdrawal, Evelyn and Adrian had their first custody meeting. Not the attorneys this time. Them, in person, in a neutral space. A conference room at a hotel that neither of them used professionally, chosen specifically for its absence of association. Patricia Hollis was present. Frank Solis was present. But the conversation was structured so that the two of them were doing most of the talking, with the attorneys available for the points that needed to be technical. It was not easy. She hadn't expected it to be. They sat across from each other at a small table and worked through, item by item, the practical architecture of raising a child in two households that were not going to merge, with two adults who had hurt each other and were now in the particular difficult position of needing to become reliable to each other anyway, for someone who had no say in the matter and all the stakes. Adrian had prepared. She could see it in the way he moved through the items, not with the aggressive efficiency of someone trying to win a negotiation, but with the specific preparedness of someone who had done the reading, who had thought about what a child needed rather than what the structure of a custody agreement typically looked like. He proposed a schedule that was more generous to her than she'd expected. Primary residence with her, with him having consistent and regular time rather than the reasonable visitation language from the original papers. He raised the question of schooling, which was years away, and said he didn't want to be the kind of parent who appeared at the important moments and was absent for the ordinary ones. He said it simply, without the performance of self-awareness, which was the version of it she could actually hear. "I want James to know me," he said, "not as a concept, as an actual person." She looked at him across the table. "Then show up," she said, "consistently. That's the whole job." "I know." They worked for 2 hours. At the end, they had an outline that both attorneys said was workable. Not perfect, not every contingency covered, but a real foundation rather than a legal minimum. When they were done, they walked out of the hotel into the late April afternoon. It was warm in the way of days that have decided spring is real and intend to prove it. The trees on the block passed full blossom, the air carrying something green and light that Manhattan managed only in the brief window between the end of winter and the beginning of summer's humidity. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not heading anywhere yet. "The earnings call is in 3 weeks," Evelyn said. "The board prep starts next week." "I know. I've been working on the narrative." He paused. "I want to run it by you before we finalize." She raised an eyebrow slightly. He had never, in 5 years of marriage, asked to run a professional narrative by her. She'd offered twice. He'd thanked her and moved on. "All right," she said. "Thursday morning?" "Thursday works." A cab went by. A delivery person on a bicycle threaded between two slowing cars with the aggressive optimism of someone who believed in their own reflexes. A woman 2 doors down was trying to get a very large piece of furniture through a door that was not quite wide enough for it, with the assistance of a man who was clearly giving directional instructions that were not helpful. "He smiled at me," Adrian said. "Last week, when I came for the Tuesday visit. James? It was—" He stopped. It was the first time. She knew. She'd been there, standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Adrian hold James in the careful, two-handed way he'd developed, and watching James look up at him with the sudden, full-faced, slightly unfocused grin that babies produced without warning and that carried a charge entirely out of proportion to its cause. She had not said anything then. She had turned and gone to the kitchen to give them the moment. "He smiles at everything right now," she said. "The lamp, the ceiling fan, me making coffee." "I know," Adrian said, "but it was still—" He didn't finish the sentence. She understood what he meant. It was still something. They went their separate ways. She walked 2 blocks to where her car was and sat in it for a moment before starting the engine. Not doing anything, just sitting. She was building something. She'd been building it for a while now, not the governance work, not the shareholder position, not any of the strategic pieces that could be put in a filing or voted on in a boardroom. Something less visible and more important. A life that was actually hers. A structure for her son to grow up inside that was made of real things, real presence, real accountability, real people doing the imperfect and necessary work of showing up. It didn't have a name. It didn't need one. She started the car. James was at home with a sitter, probably asleep, probably doing the particular thing he'd started doing lately, where he grabbed his own foot with an expression of profound surprise, as though feet were an unexpected development that warranted further investigation. She wanted to get home before he woke up. She pulled into traffic. The city went around her the way it always did, continuous, indifferent, full of its own urgencies. She moved through it the way she'd been learning to move through things, not fighting the current, not drifting with it either, finding the particular line between the two that was hers. It wasn't always easy to hold. She held it anyway. The earnings call happened on a Thursday morning in May, 6 weeks after the board restructuring, and 11 weeks after James Charles Ashford came into the world with a vigorous cry and no awareness whatsoever of the specific financial and legal architecture that had been rearranging itself around his existence. Evelyn listened to it from the south-facing window of her apartment, James in the carrier on her chest, a cup of coffee going cold on the windowsill beside her. She wasn't on the call. Board members didn't participate in earnings calls as a standard matter, and she'd made the deliberate choice not to ask for an exception. This was Adrian's performance to give. She'd reviewed the narrative with him on Thursday morning as they'd agreed, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table in her apartment with coffee and printed pages and the particular focused attention of two people who had decided to be professional with each other and were, imperfectly, managing it. The narrative was good. She'd said so, and she'd meant it. He'd made changes she suggested and hadn't made changes he disagreed with, which was the right balance. Not deference, not resistance, just two people who had different pieces of the picture working toward the same outcome. She'd noticed, sitting there, that the Adrian she was talking to was easier to be in a room with than the Adrian of the last 2 years of their marriage. Less managed, more willing to be uncertain out loud. She didn't know whether that was permanent. She suspected it wasn't entirely. People didn't transform cleanly. And Adrian Mercer was not a man whose fundamental structure was going to rearrange itself because a difficult season had forced some introspection. But something had shifted, and the shift was real. And she was realistic enough to know that real and permanent were different categories. The call lasted 47 minutes. She heard the clip later. Someone from the investor relations team sent her the recording link as a matter of course. Adrian's voice was steady throughout. The Q1 numbers were below the prior year. He named that directly, without framing, without the kind of optimistic surrounding language that usually made bad numbers sound like a planned detour. He named what had happened, a difficult quarter that included significant governance disruption, some of which was the company's responsibility, and some of which was the result of external pressure that had been repelled. He talked about the structural changes in place, the new board accountability framework, the internal security overhaul, the executive team adjustments. He talked about the company's technology position, which was genuinely strong, and the partnership pipeline, which was in better shape than the stock price reflected. Then he said something she hadn't reviewed with him, something he'd apparently added or found in the space between their Thursday meeting and the call itself. He said, "We made some decisions at the leadership level over the past 2 years that prioritize the appearance of stability over its actual substance. I'm including myself in that. The board has put structures in place to make sure that kind of gap doesn't persist again, and I'm grateful for that. Not as a formality, but because I think genuine oversight is what separates a company that lasts from one that doesn't." There was a short silence on the recorded call, the kind that happened when analysts weren't sure if the CEO had finished. Then the questions started, and he answered them. Evelyn set her phone down. James had fallen asleep in the carrier, his weight settled against her chest with the complete trust of someone who had not yet learned to be cautious. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe. Outside the window, the city was doing what it did in May. Warm now, the trees fully green, the light different from March in a way that was more than seasonal, less provisional, more committed. She thought about what Adrian had said on the call. Genuine oversight is what separates a company that lasts from one that doesn't. He believed it, she thought, or he was learning to. The distance between those two things was smaller than it used to be. The stock closed up 4.5% that Thursday. Not a dramatic recovery. One good earnings call did not erase a quarter of turbulence, and any analyst worth their fee would have said so. But it was movement in the right direction, and the quality of the movement mattered as much as its size. The commentary from the institutional investors who spoke publicly after the call was measured and cautiously constructive rather than skeptical, which was a different atmosphere than the one that had existed 6 weeks ago. Douglas Webb sent Evelyn a 2-line message. "Good day. Thought you'd want to know." She sent back, "Thank you, Douglas." She had a relationship with Douglas now that she hadn't had a month ago. Not close, not warm in any social sense, but working. He was cautious around her, which she understood. She was the person whose entry into the boardroom had been preceded by an SEC filing and a hostile fund and an investigation that had cost him a colleague. His caution was reasonable. She didn't try to dissolve it, just worked around it with the consistent professional respect that, over time, tended to replace wariness with something more functional. That was, she'd come to understand, the actual work of the governance role. Not the dramatic moments, not the board votes and the legal filings and the public announcements. The accumulation of ordinary professional encounters, each one either building or eroding the quality of the working relationships that made the whole thing function. It was slow. It was not particularly satisfying in the way that visible victories were satisfying. It was important in the way that foundations were important, which was to say you mostly noticed them when they were missing. She'd been underestimating this kind of work her whole career. She could see that now. She'd spent years in rooms that were oriented toward the large and strategic, and she'd absorbed the assumption of those rooms that the relational maintenance work was beneath the level of attention that mattered. It wasn't. The relational work was the infrastructure. Everything else ran on top of it. James had been teaching her this in his own way, without knowing he was doing it. The specific education of caring for a person who communicated only in presence, who needed not brilliance or strategy, but simply the consistent experience of being attended to. She was a better board member, she suspected, for having spent 3 months figuring out what her son needed before she'd walked into that boardroom. She was not going to say that to anyone because it would sound exactly like the kind of thing people said that was true, but insufferable. She thought it anyway. Charles Ashford came on a Thursday as he'd promised, with a single bag and the particular undemanding presence of a man who had learned, somewhere in his 60s, that the most valuable thing you could offer the people you loved was your full attention without the need to fill every silence. He sat with James for an hour that first afternoon in a way that made Evelyn stop in the doorway of the living room and watch without announcing herself. Her father was not naturally demonstrative. He was not the kind of grandfather who made faces and sang songs and performed delight for an audience. He simply held James the way he held things that mattered, with both hands, with focus, with the quality of attention that said, "This is the most important thing I am doing right now, and I know it." James looked up at him with the dark, considering eyes that were settling toward brown now, the indeterminate blue of early infancy giving way to something more specific, and produced one of his sudden whole-face smiles that arrived like a weather event. Charles said quietly, "There you are." Evelyn went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a moment with her hands around her coffee cup, doing nothing, just holding the ordinariness of the afternoon. Her father in the living room, her son in his arms, the May light coming in at the angle it came in at this time of day, touching the edge of the counter and the back wall and the top of the chair she'd been meaning to reupholster since February. This was the life she'd built, with her own choices and her own hands, and a considerable amount of help from people who loved her enough to wait while she figured out what she needed. It was not grand. It was not resolved into a finished shape. There were ongoing conversations, ongoing complications, a divorce that was technically still proceeding through the courts in the slow bureaucratic way of legal processes that had lost their urgency, a governance role that was demanding in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, a son who was changing so fast that she sometimes felt she was meeting a new person every 2 weeks. It was real. That was the thing. It was real in a way the life before it hadn't quite been. Not fake exactly, but constructed partly around an idea of what she was supposed to want, shaped by a marriage that had been built on a version of herself she'd offered without checking first whether it fit. She didn't blame Adrian for that entirely. She'd participated in her own reduction. She'd been so committed to the choice she'd made, stepping away from her family's world, proving she could build something independent, proving the life could be on her own terms, that she'd overcorrected. She'd made herself smaller than she was, not because Adrian asked her to, but because she'd confused smallness with independence and independence with freedom. They weren't the same things. She'd been figuring out the difference for a year now. She wasn't done figuring it out, but she was further along than she'd been in March, sitting in a kitchen with a Post-it note and a manila envelope, and that was something. The first formal quarterly review of Adrian's performance as CEO happened in June. It was structured around the framework the board had approved in March: specific metrics, a written self-assessment, a 360 feedback process that included input from senior staff, and a board discussion that was supposed to be honest rather than ceremonial. Helen Ferris had been clear about this from the start. The review existed to generate real information, not to perform accountability while delivering none of it. Evelyn prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly, with the particular combination of data and observation that she'd developed over years of doing work that required understanding how people and institutions actually functioned versus how they said they did. The feedback from senior staff was mixed in the specific way of feedback from people who were trying to be honest, but were also aware that their honesty was going on a record. Most of it said, in various configurations, that the leadership style had shifted, less insular than before, more open to challenge, with a troubling tendency to occasionally overcorrect into consultation when what was needed was a decision. That last piece was new, and she thought it was real. Adrian, having overcorrected in the direction of unchecked confidence, was now occasionally overcorrecting in the opposite direction, second-guessing himself in moments when the team needed him to be the one who decided. She raised this in the board discussion, directly and without softening it into something less useful. He's doing something better in one direction, she said, and creating a new problem in the other. The Q2 partnership decision took 11 days longer than it needed to because he went back to the senior team 3 times after they'd already given their input. That's not accountability. That's anxiety wearing accountability's clothes. Kenneth Park looked at her with an expression that was either appreciation or mild surprise. Helen said, "What do you recommend?" "Clarity about which decisions require broad input and which ones are his to make," Evelyn said. "A decision rights framework, not bureaucratic, practical. He needs to know when to consult and when to decide so that he's not solving his old problem by creating a new one." The board adopted the recommendation. It was drafted by the general counsel and reviewed by Evelyn before it went to Adrian. When Adrian read it, he called her. "The decision rights document," he said. "Yes. You wrote this." "I suggested it. Legal drafted it." A pause. "The section on major strategic decisions, the threshold for board consultation versus CEO authority, that's more generous than I expected." "You need to be able to run the company," she said. "The governance role isn't to turn you into a committee. It's to make sure you're accountable for the things that actually require accountability." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to figure out whether I should thank you or whether that's strange given everything." "It's a little strange," she said. "Thank me anyway." She heard something in his voice that might have been a laugh, brief, genuine, slightly surprised by itself. "Thank you." "Don't second-guess the Q3 manufacturing decision," she said. "The team has given you what they have. Make the call." "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She hung up. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. This was the texture of the thing she was building. Not one dramatic reckoning, not a clean victory that ended the story, but this. These conversations, these specific unglamorous exchanges in which 2 people who had failed each other were working out, one practical question at a time, what a functional structure between them looked like. It wasn't satisfying in any Hollywood sense. It was deeply, specifically satisfying in the way that real work was satisfying. Because it was real, because it mattered, because she was doing it rather than imagining she would eventually do it when things got easier. Things didn't get easier. You got more capable. In July, Cassandra Voss sent Evelyn a longer message. Not a text, an email, professional in format, but personal in content, the kind of thing that took time to write and showed the marks of several drafts in its careful phrasing. She said she was working as a consultant now, building her own practice. She said she wanted Evelyn to know that her actions in the period between the SEC filing and the Sentinel withdrawal had been, she used the word clarifying. That watching someone exercise legitimate power without cruelty had been clarifying in ways she was still processing. She did not ask for anything. She did not propose a lunch or a meeting or a professional relationship. She just said it, and she signed it with her first name. Evelyn read it twice. Then she wrote back. She said she appreciated the message and that she hoped the consulting work was going well. She said that the thing about clarifying moments was that they usually cost something, and she imagined Cassandra had paid for this one in ways that weren't small. She said she didn't have a larger point to make about any of it. She just hoped she was okay. She sent it. She didn't know what she felt about Cassandra Voss exactly. Complicated things, probably. The specific tangle of empathy and anger, and something that was almost understanding, which was different from forgiveness but adjacent to it. Cassandra had done real damage. She had also, at a pivotal moment, not done the thing that would have made the damage irreparable. People were not simply the worst thing they'd done, and they were not simply the best thing either. They were the whole sequence, and the sequence continued as long as they did. Evelyn had been thinking about this more generally lately, the way she'd been taught, in the world she'd grown up in, and the world she'd married into, to think about people in terms of their utility and their risk. As assets or liabilities, essentially. Clean categories that made decisions feel clear. The problem with clean categories was that they required you to stop paying attention to the actual person, who was almost always more complicated than the category could hold. She was trying, imperfectly, to pay better attention, to herself and to the people around her. It was harder than it sounded, especially for someone who had spent most of her adult life being very good at the strategic view, the long lens, the structural picture. The close-up required a different kind of patience. James was helping with that too, in his relentless way. He was 4 months old in July, and what had been a small, blinking, largely horizontal creature had become something with opinions. He had opinions about what time he wanted to wake up, which was early. He had opinions about the order of events in his morning routine, which he communicated through sounds that Evelyn had learned to decode with the specific competence of someone who had been paying close attention. He had opinions about who was in the room, about the music she played while she worked in the evenings, about the particular blanket with the small yellow bears that she'd bought at a market on a Saturday 3 weeks ago because the color was cheerful and she'd wanted something cheerful. He grabbed things now. Her hair, frequently and without mercy. The edge of his own socks, with enormous satisfaction, as though finally catching up with a project he'd been working on for weeks. Adrian's shirt collar when Adrian came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and sometimes for an extended Saturday that had become a natural addition to the schedule after the 3rd week when Adrian had simply not left, when the scheduled time ended, and she hadn't asked him to. That had been a shift she hadn't planned. She wasn't sure she'd have predicted it in March. When the idea of Adrian Mercer being a regular, ordinary presence in her apartment, not to negotiate, not to manage, just to be there because his son was there, would have seemed either impossible or dangerous. It wasn't either. It was just complicated, and complications she could handle. She did not love him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that because the proximity and the shared history and the specific complicated warmth of watching a person change were things that could be confused for love if you weren't paying attention. She cared about him, about the version of him that was emerging from what the last year had required. She wanted him to be good to their son. She wanted him to be, eventually, someone James could respect without having to work at it. That was not love. It was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name, which she'd stopped needing it to have. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in August. She found out from Patricia at 9 in the morning, a call that lasted 4 minutes, because there was nothing dramatic left to process, and Patricia was too professional to manufacture any. The numbers were settled, the custody arrangement was in place, the legal fact of the marriage was concluded. Patricia said, "That's done." Evelyn said, "Thank you for everything." "Call me when you need me," Patricia said, which was both professional and, Evelyn thought, genuinely meant. She sat with the finality of it for a little while. Not crying. She'd done the crying in pieces over the past several months. Small increments of grief processed in the early mornings, or the late nights when James was asleep and the apartment was quiet and she didn't have to manage any of it for anyone else's comfort. There was no large remaining grief today. There was something smaller and more specific, the particular recognition that a chapter had actually ended, not just been interrupted. 5 years. Portugal and the argument about dinner. The early months when he'd surprised her, and the later years when he'd stopped trying to. The morning in March with the manila envelope and the post-it note, and the sound of the door clicking shut. She was not the same person who had stood in that kitchen. She didn't know if she was better. She was skeptical of the narrative that suffering inevitably improved you, because she'd watched it break people too, had watched grief and loss and betrayal produce bitterness rather than wisdom in people who weren't equipped to process it any other way. She'd been lucky in her equipment. Lucky in her father, who had waited. Lucky in Dara, who had answered every call. Lucky in Patricia, who had been precise and fierce in the right proportions. Lucky and James, who had needed her to get up every morning regardless of what was happening, and whose need had been, in the way of profound and simple requirements, a kind of structure. She called Adrian. He answered immediately. "I heard," he said. She hadn't had to say anything. "Yeah," she said, a pause that was not uncomfortable. They had gotten better at pauses. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the version of it that required all of this." She knew what he meant. "I know. Is James up?" "He's doing his morning review of the ceiling fan. It's ongoing." She heard something, definitely a laugh this time, brief and real. "I'll see him Friday." "Friday," she said. She hung up. She picked up James from his bouncer, where he had been, indeed, conducting a focused examination of the ceiling fan, and she carried him to the window and stood there in the August morning light. He was heavier now, almost 14 pounds, which she still marveled at in the way she marveled at most things about his development, with a specific astonishment that the ordinary process of a person growing could feel so particular, so specific to him, as though no one had done it before in exactly this way. He was looking at her now instead of the fan. "Okay," she said, to him and to herself, and to no one specifically. "Okay." The third quarter earnings call was in October. By October, several things had changed. The decision rights framework had worked. The Q3 partnership decision, which had been the proving ground, had moved efficiently, with one round of senior input and then a CEO call that the team had received clearly. The stock had recovered to within 6% of its pre-turbulence high. 3 of the major institutional investors who had been on the edge of reducing their positions had instead held, with one adding modestly to its stake after a direct meeting with Evelyn and Helen that had focused less on the dramatic events of spring and more on the company's structural improvements and 2-year roadmap. Adrian had also done something she hadn't expected. He'd launched an employee feedback program. Not a survey, those were easy to produce and easy to ignore, but a structured series of small group conversations across the company, different departments and levels, recorded and summarized into a quarterly report that went to the full board. His explanation, delivered to the board in September with the directness he'd been developing, was, if the board's oversight function is going to mean something, you need real information from inside the company, not information that's been processed through the executive layer first. Kenneth Park had called Evelyn after that board meeting and said, "He's learning." "He is," she'd said. She hadn't added, "So am I." But she was. The board work was harder than she'd anticipated and more interesting than she'd anticipated, in the specific ratio those two things usually came in when something was worth doing. She'd made mistakes, a question at the September meeting that had been too pointed given the room's dynamics, a recommendation she'd pushed harder than warranted before she had the full operational picture. She'd acknowledged both, corrected course, and moved forward. Making a mistake and then handling it well turned out to be more credibility building than not making the mistake in the first place, which was not a lesson she'd been taught but was discovering empirically. She'd also been doing something else, quietly, in the margins of the governance work and the parenting and the ongoing reconstruction of a life. She'd been having conversations, with founders mostly, specifically with early-stage company founders, who were at the inflection point where growth required governance, and governance required the kind of institutional knowledge that most young companies lacked entirely. She'd been approached 3 times in 6 months by people who had heard she'd joined the Mercer board, who knew who her father was, and who wanted access to the kind of perspective she'd spent the last year developing at considerable personal cost. She wasn't ready to formalize anything yet. She was too new to the work, too early in understanding its dimensions. But she was taking the meetings, listening, asking the questions she'd learned to ask, planting the seeds of something she could see the shape of, but not the full structure. Her father had called it, on a Sunday afternoon call in September, the right problem to work on. Because? She'd asked. Because most of the governance dysfunction that eventually destroys companies starts at exactly that point, he said. When the founder is still running it like a personal project, but the company has become a public trust. Someone needs to close that gap. Someone who knows what it costs when it doesn't get closed, she said. Yes, he said. Among other things. James stood up for the first time in November. Not walked, stood, briefly, holding the edge of the coffee table with the concentrated effort of someone who had discovered that vertical was a direction and was extremely interested in its implications. He stood for approximately 4 seconds and then sat down hard on his padded bottom, looked at Evelyn with an expression of complete astonishment, and then laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. A full laugh, not a smile, not the sounds he made when something surprised him, but an actual laugh. Loud and unself-conscious and total. She sat on the floor across from him and laughed too. She didn't cry, which surprised her slightly, because she'd been warned by everyone with children that these moments produced crying, that the milestones arrived carrying a weight of time and feeling that was almost impossible to hold without some kind of physical response. But what she felt wasn't sad in any direction. It was full. A specific kind of fullness that she hadn't had words for until just now. The feeling of being exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what mattered, with the particular clarity that came not from certainty, but from having done the work required to be present for it. She called Adrian and held the phone toward James, who performed no further standing but did wave one hand in the general direction of the sound of his father's voice. "Was that a—" Adrian started. "His first stand," she said. A pause. "I missed it." "You'll see the next 50, she said. "He's going to be obsessive about it for weeks now. He's made up his mind." "Yeah," Adrian said, quietly. "Yeah, okay." She could hear what was in his voice. She didn't name it. Some things were better acknowledged without words, just felt and moved through and carried forward into whatever came next. There was a moment in December that she thought about for a long time afterward. She was at a small board dinner, informal, the kind Helen organized once a quarter as a way of maintaining the relational context that formal meetings couldn't hold, and she was talking to Kenneth Park about something adjacent to governance, something about the structure of accountability in institutions more generally, when Kenneth said, "You know what I've noticed about you? You don't do this for the position." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Some people on boards, the way they operate. You can feel that the governance work is in service of something else. Status, connection, being in the room." He was not being unkind. He was being, in the way he usually was, precise. "With you it's reversed. You're in the room because you care about the governance work. The position is incidental." She thought about that. "I'm not sure I'd have said that about myself a year ago." "No," he said. "A year ago you were figuring out what you were doing here. Now you know." She wasn't certain he was right, exactly. She still had moments of uncertainty about the right call, about whether her read on a situation was accurate or filtered through something personal she hadn't fully accounted for. She still occasionally had to remind herself that the goal was not to be right, but to get it right, which required staying open to the possibility of being wrong in ways that the environment she'd come from had not especially encouraged. But she knew something. She knew what it felt like to be doing the things she was supposed to be doing with the abilities she actually had, rather than some adjacent version of it that looked better on paper. That was enough. More than enough. On a Thursday morning in January, almost exactly a year from the Tuesday in March, when a manila envelope had arrived on a kitchen table, Evelyn sat in a boardroom at Mercer Technologies and delivered her first formal governance report as a board director. The room held the same 7 members, the same general counsel, the same outside counsel presence. Adrian was at one end of the table. She was at the other, which had happened without anyone arranging it, and which had stopped feeling remarkable several meetings ago. The report covered 4 areas: the decision rights framework's first 6 months of operation and its observed effects, an analysis of the employee feedback program data from Q3 and Q4, a comparative review of the company's governance practices against peer institutions, and a set of 3 recommendations for the coming year. She had written it herself, with input from Patricia on the legal dimensions and from her father's office on the comparative benchmarking. It was 41 pages, including appendices. It was, she thought, good work. Not perfect. There were sections she'd have written differently with more time, and one of the recommendations she was genuinely uncertain about and had said so in the text rather than softening the uncertainty into false confidence. She walked through it in 25 minutes. The questions took another 40. When it was done, Helen Ferris said, "This is what board oversight should look like." She said it to the room, not specifically to Evelyn, which was the right way to say it. After the meeting, she took the elevator down alone and walked out of the building into the January air, which was cold in the specific committed way of January in New York, the kind of cold that made no apology and expected none. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. A year. Not a clean year. Full of things she hadn't chosen and things she had. Full of the unglamorous work of building something real out of materials that had included, among other things, a failed marriage, a newborn, a hostile fund, a corporate investigation, and the specific education of understanding who she was when things required her to be that rather than a managed version of it. She hadn't won anything exactly. She didn't think of it in those terms. She had arrived somewhere, at a life that was real, at work that mattered, at a relationship with her son that was the most important thing she'd ever built, at a version of herself that she recognized. That was not a small thing to have arrived at. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dara. Q4 report looks great. Kenneth Park told a friend who told a friend who told me. You're making a name for yourself, Evie. She smiled. She typed back, the name I already had is fine. A cab went by. Two people walked past with their heads down against the wind. The city moved the way it always moved, which was without reference to any individual life and yet somehow containing all of them. The whole accumulated fact of people making choices and living with them and building things in the space between where they started and where they ended up. She'd thought, in the worst of last spring, that the things she had lost could not be replaced. She'd been right about that, and she'd been wrong about what it meant. They couldn't be replaced. They also didn't need to be. She wasn't building a replacement. She was building what came next. What came next was James, who would be walking by spring if his current rate of vertical ambition held, and who had recently discovered that his own hands were a source of considerable entertainment, and who regarded the world with the wide-open, unguarded attention of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of it. She hoped, with the particular fierce and practical hope of a person who understood what she was hoping for, that she could help keep that quality in him as long as possible. Not forever. The world would teach him what it taught everyone eventually, and her job wasn't to prevent that, but to make sure he had enough foundation to survive it without being broken by it. That was the long work, the work without an end date, the most important thing she would ever do. She flagged a cab. There was no elegant final realization, no arrived wisdom that tied the year into a bow. There was just this. She had been through something hard and had come out on the other side of it as herself. More herself than before, if that meant anything, less of what she'd unconsciously assembled to please, protect, or manage, and more of what was actually there when you stripped that back. She had not needed to destroy anything to find it. She had needed to stop pretending the thing she'd walked away from could be reclaimed by reducing herself to fit inside someone else's version of her life. She had needed to stop being quiet in the ways that were really just absence dressed up as dignity. She had needed to let what was real, the position, the capacity, the specific and considerable abilities she'd spent a lifetime developing, exist in the world without apologizing for the space it took up. That was not a lesson she'd been taught. It was a lesson she'd earned. The cab pulled up. She got in, gave her address, and watched the city go by outside the window, the January streets, the people moving fast against the cold, the buildings holding their particular lights in the early afternoon dark. All of it ordinary, all of it continuous, all of it part of the same city that had been going about its business on a Tuesday morning in March when everything changed and that had not stopped for a single moment since then, not for her grief or her choices or her son's first breath or any of it. The world didn't stop. That had once seemed like indifference. She understood now that it was something else. It was the fact that the world was large enough to contain all of it, her marriage and its ending, the fight to hold something worth holding, a boy who stood up at a coffee table and laughed at the surprise of himself, a year of work that mattered, and still keep moving, still make room. She was 41 years old and she was going home to her son. That was enough. That was everything.